The wanted poster fluttered in the late afternoon breeze, its edges worn and stained with desert dust. Jedediah Calloway studied the face on the paper, a man with cold eyes and a jagged scar running from temple to chin. $500 dead or alive. A handsome sum for most men in these parts. For Jed, it was simply the next task. He folded the poster carefully, tucking it into his weathered leather vest, before adjusting his position behind the large boulder. His Winchester rifle rested comfortably in his hands, a tool he handled with the casual expertise of a craftsman. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the small cabin nestled in the pine-covered valley below. The October wind carried the first hint of winter's approach, stirring the ponderosa pines and sending golden aspen leaves dancing to the ground. Jed pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders and continued his vigil. Patience had kept him alive through the war and the difficult years that followed. Patience would serve him now. As dusk settled over the Colorado mountains, a thin wisp of smoke finally rose from the cabin's stone chimney. Jed's quarry had returned. He allowed himself a slow, measured breath, then gathered his rifle and began his descent. The cabin door splintered inward with a single powerful kick. Jed's entrance was swift and precise, rifle raised and ready. The wanted man, Silas Barton, cattle rustler and murderer, barely had time to reach for his revolver before Jed's voice cut through the room. "I wouldn't." Barton froze, hand hovering over his holster. His eyes, wide with surprise, quickly narrowed in calculation. "Calloway," he said, recognition dawning on his scarred face. "They sent the best after me, I see. Drop the gun belt. Slow." Jed's voice carried no emotion, just quiet authority. Barton complied, unbuckling his belt and letting it fall to the rough-hewn floor. "You planning to take me in alive? That's a long, dangerous ride back to Denver." "That depends on you." Jed kept the rifle steady, his weathered face revealing nothing. 5 men died in that raid on the Hancock Ranch. One was just 16. Something like shame flickered across Barton's features. "Wasn't supposed to go that way. Hancock's boy wasn't meant to be there." Jed studied the man before him, looking beyond the scar and the outlaw reputation. What he saw was familiar, another broken soul carrying the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. He'd encountered many such men since the war, and sometimes glimpsed the same hollow-eyed stare in his own reflection. "You've got family?" Jed asked. The question seemed to catch Barton off guard. "Wife and 2 little ones. In Pueblo." His voice cracked slightly. "Haven't seen them in 3 years." Jed nodded once. "Write them a letter. You've got 5 minutes." Barton stared in disbelief. "You'd do that?" "5 minutes," Jed repeated, gesturing toward the small table in the corner. As Barton hastily scribbled his final words to his family, Jed kept the rifle trained on him, maintaining a careful distance. This moment of mercy wasn't born of weakness. Even the condemned deserved a chance to set right what they could before facing judgment. When the letter was sealed, Jed took it with his free hand, tucking it securely into his coat. "I'll see it delivered." "Thank you," Barton said, the words rough and unpracticed. "Will you tell them I died quick fighting, maybe?" "I'll tell them you faced the end with dignity," Jed replied. "And regret." The setting sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Jed secured Barton's hands with iron cuffs. The decision to bring him in alive had been made not from the bounty notice, but in that moment of recognition, the moment Jed saw not just an outlaw, but a man who might yet find redemption, even if only in his final hours. The small stone marker stood in the shadow of a gnarled pine, one of dozens in the humble cemetery behind Valley Creek's white-steepled church. Jed knelt before it, removing his hat, as he placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The inscription was simple: Elizabeth Calloway and Sarah Calloway, beloved wife and daughter, gone to God's embrace, ATTC 9. 7 years had passed, yet the ache remained as fresh as the day he'd returned to find nothing but ashes where his home had stood. Elizabeth with her gentle laugh and steady hands, little Sarah just 6 years old with her father's eyes and her mother's determined spirit, both taken while he was away tracking a bounty in Wyoming territory. "I miss you both," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he allowed himself to show only here in this sacred space. Every day. The church bell tolled the hour, its resonant chime carrying across the small cemetery. Jed remained kneeling for a moment longer, then rose and settled his hat back on his head. He'd delivered Barton to the Denver authorities 3 days ago, collected his bounty, and now found himself drawn back to Valley Creek, a place that held both his deepest pain and his most cherished memories. As he walked through the town's main street, Jed noted the changes since his last visit 6 months ago. New storefronts had appeared, and the population seemed to have grown. The railroad's approach was transforming many such small settlements across the territory, bringing prosperity to some and displacement to others. Valley Creek had been his home once, back when he'd tried to build a life after the war. Before the fire. Before he'd embraced the solitary existence of a bounty hunter, moving from town to town, wanted poster to wanted poster, allowing himself no connections that could be severed by tragedy again. The commotion at the courthouse drew his attention. A crowd had gathered on the steps, mostly men with a few women standing at the edges. Their expressions ranged from amusement to discomfort, but all eyes were fixed on whatever spectacle was unfolding at the top of the stone steps. Curiosity pulled Jed forward. As he approached, the crowd parted slightly, affording him a clearer view. What he saw made his jaw tighten. 5 women stood in a line at the top of the courthouse steps, each looking varying degrees of frightened and resigned. 4 were dressed simply but neatly, their hair combed and faces clean. But the 5th woman, positioned at the far end of the line, was a stark contrast. Her ankles were bound with iron chains, her dress little more than a tattered gray rag. Dirt and bruises marked her skin, and her dark hair hung in tangled waves, partially obscuring her face. Standing before them was Judge Harrison Patterson, a man Jed remembered well from his days in Valley Creek. Patterson had been newly appointed when Jed lived here, bringing with him a reputation for harsh sentencing and unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. Now, 7 years later, his once dark hair had silvered at the temples, but his commanding presence remained unchanged as he addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen of Valley Creek," Patterson announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathered spectators. "As is our custom with women who have violated the town's moral codes or found themselves without proper means of support, we offer them a chance at redemption through matrimony." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jed had heard of such practices in frontier towns, women arrested for minor offenses, or vagrancy being offered marriage instead of jail time, but had never witnessed it firsthand. It struck him as a particularly cruel form of justice, trading one form of captivity for another. "The first 4 ladies have committed minor infractions and have agreed to this arrangement," Patterson continued, gesturing to the 4 well-kept women. "They will be introduced, and interested parties may speak with them and their current guardians about suitable arrangements." His attention then turned to the chained woman at the end, and his expression hardened. "As for this one," he paused, and something in his tone made Jed's skin crawl. "This woman stands accused of more serious crimes, but in the spirit of Christian charity, she too is being offered this opportunity rather than the cell she deserves. Jed studied the woman more carefully. Despite her bedraggled appearance, she stood straight, her chin lifted in what seemed like defiance rather than hope. When she shifted slightly, he caught a glimpse of her face, young, perhaps in her late 20s, with striking features despite the dirt, and a darkening bruise along her cheekbone. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, clear, intelligent, and burning with a contained fury. "Sheriff," Patterson called, and a broad-shouldered man stepped forward from beside the courthouse door. "Bring the First Lady forward and announce her qualifications." As the proceedings began, Jed found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the chained woman. There was something in her demeanor that spoke of strength rather than criminality. The chains seemed excessive, the treatment unnecessarily harsh. Whatever she had done or was accused of doing, the display struck Jed as wrong. The auction progressed with each of the first 4 women being introduced and their qualifications as potential wives announced. 2 were quickly spoken for by men in the crowd. The third was returned to her position when no suitable offers emerged. The fourth was still being discussed when Judge Patterson's voice cut through the negotiations. "Calloway!" The sound of his name startled Jed. He looked up to find Patterson staring directly at him, a strange smile playing at the corners of the judge's mouth. "I thought that was you lurking at the back." Patterson continued gesturing for Jed to approach. "Valley Creek's prodigal son returns." Jed made no move to come closer. "Just passing through, Judge." "Nonsense!" Patterson waved him forward insistently. "A man of your reputation deserves special consideration. Come up here." Reluctantly, Jed made his way through the crowd and up the courthouse steps. He could feel the eyes of the town upon him, hear the whispers of recognition. The bounty hunter, the widower, the man who'd left after tragedy struck. "Jedediah Calloway," Patterson announced to the crowd, "has brought more criminals to justice than our modest jail could ever hold. His service to law and order across the territory deserves recognition." He turned to Jed with that same unsettling smile. "Pick any wife for free, Calloway. The court's gift to you for your service." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Jed stood motionless, anger building beneath his calm exterior. "I'm not in the market, Judge," he said evenly. "Every man needs a companion," Patterson insisted. "Especially one who wanders as you do. Someone to keep your bedroll warm, perhaps cook a decent meal." More laughter from the crowd, crueler now. Jed's gaze drifted to the women, seeing the humiliation in their downcast eyes, all except the chained woman who stared directly at him with an intensity that was almost challenging. "I don't want a wife," Jed stated firmly. Patterson's smile tightened. "Consider it Calloway. No man refuses a gift from this court." The subtle threat beneath the words was unmistakable. Jed had heard stories of how Patterson's influence had grown in Valley Creek, how crossing him often led to unfortunate consequences. The judge had always craved power, and it seemed he'd acquired it in abundance during Jed's absence. Jed looked again at the line of women, his gaze settling on the one in chains. There was something in her eyes, not just defiance, but a desperate intelligence, as if she were silently communicating something vital. He caught the slight movement of her eyes toward Patterson, then back to him. In that moment, Jed made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "Her," he said, pointing to the chained woman. Silence fell over the courthouse steps. Patterson's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "Her," the judge repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You can have your pick of proper women, and you choose the criminal." "You offered me any of them," Jed replied steadily. "I choose her." Patterson studied Jed's face for a long moment, as if trying to decipher his motives. Finally, He gave a curt nod to the sheriff. "Release her to Mr. Calloway's custody, then." The sheriff hesitated. "Sir, she's awaiting serious charges." "I'm aware, Reynolds," Patterson snapped. "But if Calloway wants to saddle himself with this particular burden, who are we to deny him?" He turned back to Jed, his voice dropping to ensure only those on the steps could hear. "She's unmanageable, Calloway. Wild. I won't be held responsible when she puts a knife in your back." Jed met Patterson's gaze steadily. "I'll take my chances." The sheriff Reynolds Patterson had called him, moved reluctantly toward the chained woman keys jingling in his hand. As he knelt to unlock the shackles from her ankles, Jed caught a glimpse of raw, abraded skin beneath the iron. The sight stirred something in him, not just sympathy, but a slow-burning anger at such callous treatment. When the chains fell away, the woman stood perfectly still, as if unsure what to do with this unexpected freedom. Reynolds gestured roughly for her to go to Jed. She approached cautiously, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks of the courthouse porch. Up close, Jed could see that she was indeed younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29. Despite the dirt and bruises, there was a dignity in her bearing that impressed him. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She studied him for a moment, before answering, her voice low and slightly hoarse, as if from disuse. "Abigail Hayes." After a pause, she added, "Most call me Abby." Jed nodded once. "Let's go." He turned to leave, not offering his arm or attempting to touch her. She followed a step behind her movements, stiff but determined. As they descended the courthouse steps, the crowd parted, expressions ranging from amusement to disgust to curiosity. "You'll regret this choice, Calloway," Patterson called after them, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "That woman has a habit of seeing things she shouldn't, and a mouth that could hang a man." Jed didn't turn back, but he felt Abby stiffen beside him at the judge's words. Whatever she had witnessed, whatever had led to her chains and imprisonment, was clearly at the heart of Patterson's interest in her. And now, for better or worse, her fate had become entangled with his own. They had reached the edge of the crowd when a voice called out from behind them. "Calloway, a word." Jed turned to see Sheriff Reynolds approaching, his hand resting casually on his holster. The man was vaguely familiar. Something about the eyes and the set of his jaw stirred distant memories. "Reynolds," Jed acknowledged, suddenly placing him. "Tom Reynolds, you were with the 3rd Colorado." A flicker of surprise crossed the sheriff's face. "Didn't think you'd remember. We weren't in the same company." "I remember the men who fought alongside me," Jed replied simply. Reynolds glanced at Abby, then back to Jed. "Walk with me a moment." "Alone." Jed hesitated, looking at Abby. "Wait here," he said. "I won't be long." She nodded once, wrapping her arms around herself in the cool autumn air. Jed followed Reynolds a short distance away, out of earshot, but still within sight of Abby. The sheriff seemed uncomfortable, constantly scanning their surroundings, as if worried about being overheard. "What are you doing, Calloway?" Reynolds asked finally, his voice low and urgent. "Do you have any idea what you've stepped into? Enlighten me." Reynolds sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning hair. "That woman saw something she shouldn't have. Something that could get her killed. And now you too, if you're not careful." "What did she see?" "I can't—" Reynolds cut himself off, glancing back toward the courthouse. "Look, I owe you for what happened outside Richmond. That bullet would have found my heart if you hadn't pulled me down when you did." And Jed remembered the moment, a rainy day in Virginia, the desperate chaos of battle. A young private frozen in the open as Confederate sharpshooters took aim. "So consider this repayment," Reynolds continued. Take that woman and ride out of Valley Creek today. Don't stop until you're well beyond Patterson's reach. He won't let her live Calloway. She knows too much. Jed studied the man before him once, a frightened young soldier, now a lawman apparently caught between duty and conscience. If she witnessed a crime, why not bring charges? You're the sheriff. A bitter laugh escaped Reynolds. Sheriff in name only. Patterson runs this town, this county. He's got judges and politicians in his pocket all the way to Denver. He leaned closer. The last man who stood against him ended up swinging from a cottonwood with rustling charges that appeared out of nowhere. Jed absorbed this information silently. The Valley Creek he'd returned to was clearly not the same town he'd left 7 years ago. Why help her now? He asked. Why not before she ended up in chains? Shame crossed Reynolds's face. I have a family, Calloway. A wife, 2 boys. Patterson made it clear what would happen if I interfered. He straightened his shoulders slightly. But I can at least try to keep you from ending up dead in a ditch somewhere. Jed nodded slowly. I appreciate the warning. Don't appreciate it. Heed it. Reynolds settled his hat back on his head. And if anyone asks, this conversation never happened. As the sheriff walked away, Jed returned to where Abby waited, her eyes tracking Reynolds's retreat with undisguised suspicion. What did he want? She asked, her voice still rough, but with an edge of intelligence that confirmed Jed's initial impression. To warn me about you, Jed replied honestly, and about Patterson. She studied his face, searching for something, deception, perhaps, or fear. Finding neither, she simply nodded. We should leave. Now. Once Patterson reconsiders, he'll send men after us. My horse is at the livery. Can you walk that far? She glanced down at her bare, abraded feet, then back up with grim determination. I've endured worse. Jed removed his coat and held it out to her. Take this. It's getting colder. Abby hesitated, eyeing the offered garment with suspicion. Why are you helping me? It was a fair question, one Jed himself wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Something about her situation had struck a chord in him. Perhaps it was the injustice of her treatment, or the echo of vulnerability that reminded him of Elizabeth and Sarah. Or maybe it was simply that after years of hunting the guilty, he recognized innocence when he saw it. Let's just say I don't much care for Patterson's version of justice, he replied finally. Now, take the coat. We've got a long ride ahead. The livery stable smelled of hay, horse, and leather, familiar comforting scents to a man who spent most of his life on the trail. Jed's stallion, a powerful chestnut named Samson, nickered softly in recognition as they approached his stall. Will he carry double? Abby asked, eyeing the horse with experienced appraisal that surprised Jed. For a while, he confirmed. But we'll need to get you your own mount when we reach the next town. She nodded, then winced as she shifted her weight from one battered foot to another. Jed noticed and frowned. Sit, he instructed, pointing to a hay bale near the stall. Let me see your feet. She hesitated, suspicion flickering across her features. You'll be no good to either of us if you can't walk, Jed said reasonably, and we may need to move fast once we're on the trail. With obvious reluctance, Abby perched on the hay bale and extended her feet. The sight made Jed's jaw tighten. Both were lacerated and bruised with angry red welts where the shackles had chafed against her ankles. Without comment, Jed retrieved his saddlebags and extracted a small kit of medical supplies, a habit born of necessity in his solitary profession. He knelt before her and gently cleaned each foot with water from his canteen and a clean cloth, then applied a salve to the worst of the abrasions. This will help with the pain and prevent infection. he explained as he worked his large hands surprisingly gentle. But you'll need proper boots, as soon as possible. Abby watched him with guarded curiosity. You've done this before. Jed didn't look up from his task. The war taught me basic doctoring, and I've had my share of injuries on the trail. When he'd finished tending to her feet, he pulled a pair of worn but clean socks from his saddlebag and offered them to her. These will provide some protection until we can get you proper footwear. And she accepted the socks, slipping them over her freshly treated feet. Thank you. She said the words seeming to come with difficulty, as if gratitude was an emotion long unpracticed. Jed merely nodded and moved to saddle Samson, checking the cinch and making sure his rifle was securely in its scabbard. He could feel Abby watching his every movement, studying him with the careful assessment of someone whose survival had come to depend on reading others accurately. "Why did you choose me?" she asked suddenly. "Back at the courthouse, you could have walked away, or chosen one of the others." Jed continued his preparations as he considered his answer. "The others had people willing to speak for them. You didn't. So it was pity." He turned to face her then. "No, it was recognition." "Of what?" "Someone being punished for something other than what they're accused of." He secured the last of his provisions to the saddle. "I've been a bounty hunter long enough to know when charges don't match the punishment. Those chains weren't for any ordinary crime." A shadow crossed her face. "No, they weren't." Before she could elaborate, the stable door creaked open. Both turned sharply toward the sound. A boy of about 12 stood in the doorway, his clothes dusty and his expression anxious. "Mr. Calloway?" he asked tentatively. Jed nodded, his hand instinctively moving closer to his holster. "Sheriff Reynolds sent me," the boy continued. "He says to tell you that the judge has changed his mind. Men are being gathered now to come after you and the prisoner." Abby rose quickly from the hay bale, wincing slightly as her injured feet took her weight. "We need to leave, now." Jed handed the boy a coin. "Thank Reynolds for me, then forget you saw us." The boy nodded earnestly, pocketing the coin before disappearing back through the stable door. With practiced efficiency, Jed helped Abby onto Samson's back, then swung up behind her. The horse snorted at the unusual double burden, but responded readily to Jed's commands as they emerged from the stable into the late afternoon light. Rather than heading down the main street, Jed guided Samson through a narrow alley between buildings, emerging on a less traveled side road that led toward the eastern edge of town. They had nearly reached the outskirts when Abby suddenly tensed in front of him. "Riders," she said quietly, nodding toward a rise ahead where 3 mounted men had appeared silhouetted against the darkening sky. Jed assessed their options quickly. The men hadn't spotted them yet, but they were positioned to intercept anyone leaving town by the main eastern route. "Hold on," he instructed, turning Samson sharply south toward a densely wooded area that ran alongside a shallow creek. The horse responded admirably, breaking into a gallop that ate up the distance between them and the sheltering trees. They had nearly reached the tree line when a shout went up behind them. The men had spotted their movement and were now in pursuit, their horses thundering across the open ground. Jed urged Samson to greater speed, guiding him into the trees where the dense undergrowth would slow their pursuers. The stallion navigated the obstacles with sure-footed confidence, but Jed knew they couldn't maintain this pace for long, with double the normal weight. "They're gaining," Abby warned, glancing back over Jed's shoulder. "Not for long," he replied, steering Samson toward a particularly dense section of forest. As soon as they were momentarily hidden from view, he reined the horse sharply behind a large fallen log. "Down," he ordered, sliding from the saddle and helping Abby dismount. He positioned her behind the massive trunk, then quickly loosened Samson's saddle and gave the horse a light slap on the flank. "Go on," he whispered. The well-trained animal trotted off deeper into the woods, following a small game trail that would leave clear tracks. Drawing his Winchester, Jed crouched beside Abby behind the log. "Stay down," he murmured. "And whatever happens, don't make a sound." She nodded, her breathing controlled, despite the fear evident in her eyes. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the crack of branches and the voices of their pursuers. "I saw them come this way," one man called. "The tracks lead east." "Spread out," another voice commanded. "Carson, follow those horse tracks. Miller, circle around to cut them off if they double back. I'll continue straight through." Jed remained perfectly still as the riders separated, the sound of hoofbeats fading in different directions. One set, however, grew louder, approaching their hiding place directly. Through a small gap in the log, Jed could see a burly man with a thick beard dismount and examine the ground rifle in hand. It was only a matter of time before he discovered their true location. Beside him, Abby slowly reached down and grasped a rock the size of her fist. Jed gave her a warning look, but she merely held his gaze. The rock gripped firmly in her hand. The bearded man was less than 20 feet away. Now his attention focused on the ground as he tracked their movements. When he looked up, his gaze passed right over their hiding place, then returned, narrowing as he registered the unnatural shape among the forest debris. "Found something," he called out, raising his rifle. In one fluid motion, Jed rose from behind the log, Winchester leveled. "Drop it!" he commanded. The man hesitated, his rifle half raised. For a tense moment, Jed thought he would attempt to fire. Then, assessing the situation, he carefully lowered his weapon to the ground. "Hands where I can see them." Jed continued moving from behind the log while keeping his rifle trained on the man. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes darted between Jed and the forest behind him, clearly calculating the arrival time of his companions. "Judge Patterson wants the girl back," he replied finally. "Says she's an escaped prisoner." "She's in my custody now," Jed stated firmly. The judge changed his mind about that arrangement. The man's gaze shifted to something over Jed's shoulder, and a small smile touched his lips. "And he doesn't like being refused." Jed sensed the movement behind him a second too late. As he began to turn, something hard struck the back of his head, sending him staggering forward as stars exploded across his vision. He managed to keep his grip on the Winchester twisting as he fell to bring it to bear on his attacker. The second man, Miller, he presumed, stood over him with a tree branch raised for another blow. Jed fired the shot, going wide as his vision swam, but enough to make Miller jump back in alarm. The first man was reaching for his dropped rifle when a blur of movement caught Jed's peripheral vision. Abby emerged from behind the log and hurled her rock with surprising accuracy, striking the bearded man's temple with a solid thud. He crumpled to his knees, momentarily stunned. Miller recovered quickly and lunged for Jed, who was still struggling to clear his vision. The man's boot connected with Jed's ribs, sending a burst of pain through his chest. As Miller drew back for another kick, Abby seized the fallen man's rifle and swung it like a club, catching Miller across the shoulders. The blow wasn't powerful enough to seriously injure, but it distracted Miller long enough for Jed to roll away and regain his footing. Blood trickled down the back of his neck from the head wound, but his vision was clearing. Miller turned on Abby, with a snarl, lunging for the rifle she now clutched inexpertly. She backpedaled, trying to bring the weapon to bear, but her injured feet slowed her movements. Jed raised his Winchester and fired a warning shot that splintered bark from a tree inches from Miller's head. "Next one won't miss," he promised, his voice deadly calm, despite the throbbing pain in his skull. Miller froze, then slowly raised his hands. The bearded man was also recovering, rising unsteadily to his feet, with one hand pressed to his bleeding temple. "Tell Patterson that Abigail Hayes is under my protection now," Jed stated, keeping his rifle trained on the men. "If he wants her, he'll have to come himself." "You're making a mistake, Calloway," the bearded man growled. "Nobody crosses the judge and lives to boast about it." "I'll take my chances," Jed motioned with his rifle. "Now start walking back toward town, and if I see either of you again, I won't waste time with warnings." The men exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to return empty-handed. But facing Jed's unwavering aim and the evidence of his willingness to use the weapon, they had little choice. Slowly, they began walking in the direction of Valley Creek. Jed waited until they were out of sight, then lowered his rifle with a grimace, the adrenaline ebbing to leave pain in its wake. He pressed his hand to the back of his head, his fingers coming away bloody. "Let me see," Abby said, moving to examine his injury. Her hands were gentle as she parted his hair to assess the damage. "It's not too deep, but head wounds bleed excessively. We should clean it." Jed studied her with newfound curiosity. "You handled yourself well back there." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I'm not as helpless as I appear." "So I noticed." He winced as she probed the wound. "Where did you learn to throw like that? My father believed girls should know how to defend themselves." Her expression darkened. He was right. Before Jed could inquire further, the sound of distant hoofbeats reminded them of their precarious situation. "The third man will be back soon, when he doesn't find our trail," he said. "We need to move." He let out a sharp whistle, and after a moment, Samson came trotting back through the trees, still saddled, though the cinch had loosened. Jed quickly secured it, then helped Abby mount before climbing up behind her. "Which way?" she asked as he gathered the reins. Jed considered their options. Valley Creek lay to the west, Patterson's men to the east. North led to more populated areas where they might be recognized, while south. South, he decided. There's an old trapper's cabin in the foothills that few know about. We can rest there, tend to our wounds, and plan our next move. As Samson picked his way carefully through the forest, Jed became acutely aware of Abby's proximity. She sat stiffly in front of him, maintaining as much distance as the saddle allowed, her back straight and shoulders tense. "You don't have to fear me," he said quietly. She didn't turn, but he felt some of the rigidity leave her posture. "I don't fear you," she replied after a moment, "but trust doesn't come easily to me anymore." "Fair enough." He guided Samson around a fallen tree. "But if we're going to survive what's coming, we'll need to establish some level of trust." "What's coming?" she asked, a note of weariness entering her voice. "Patterson won't stop with those 3 men," Jed replied grimly. "Whatever you saw, whatever you know, he clearly considers it worth killing for." She was silent for so long that Jed thought she might not respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible above the sound of Samson's hooves on the forest floor. "He killed a man, Marshall Weaver. Shot him in the back when the marshal discovered evidence of land fraud." Jed absorbed this information without surprise. It confirmed his suspicions about Patterson's character and explained the lengths to which the judge would go to silence Abby. "And you witnessed this?" She nodded. "I was cleaning in the courthouse late one evening. Heard them arguing, saw everything through a partially open door. Patterson caught me watching as I tried to leave. His men chased me, but I made it to the church before they caught up." Something in her tone made Jed pause. "The church?" "My father was the pastor," she said, the words heavy with grief. "He tried to protect me, to reason with Patterson. They killed him too, made it look like an accident. A fire." The word hit Jed like a physical blow. Fire. The same cruel method that had taken his family. "I'm sorry," he said, the inadequate words all he could offer. "They held me in the jail for weeks," she continued, as if needing to expel the poison of the memories. "Said I killed Weaver and would hang unless I recanted what I'd seen. When I refused, Patterson decided a more public humiliation would serve as a better example. Hence, the auction." Jed's grip on the reins tightened, anger coursing through him at the calculated cruelty of Patterson's actions. Not content with murder, the judge had sought to break Abby's spirit through degradation before silencing her permanently. "How long ago did this happen?" he asked. "My father died a month ago," she replied. "Weaver a week before that." Recent wounds still raw and bleeding, Jed knew all too well how grief could hollow a person from the inside out, leaving only a shell of who they once were. Yet Abby had endured her losses and still found the strength to fight back, to maintain her dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. "We'll find a way to bring Patterson to justice," he promised, the words emerging before he could consider their implications. It had been years since he'd involved himself in anything beyond the straightforward pursuit of bounties. The complexities of confronting a corrupt judge with political connections were far beyond his usual operations. Abby turned slightly in the saddle to regard him with those penetrating eyes. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger's cause?" Jed met her gaze steadily. "Because 7 years ago, I lost my wife and daughter in a fire while I was away hunting bounties. The authorities called it an accident, but I've never been convinced." Understanding dawned in her expression. "You think Patterson was involved?" "I don't know," Jed admitted. "But I do know that Valley Creek changed after he arrived, and not for the better. And I've carried the weight of not being there to protect my family every day since. Perhaps helping you is a way to honor their memory." She studied him for a moment longer, then turned back to face forward. "I'm sorry about your family," she said softly. They rode in silence after that, each absorbed in private grief and shared purpose as the forest grew darker around them. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky when Jed finally guided Samson up a narrow path that wound between large boulders. "Almost there," he said, noting how Abby swayed slightly with fatigue. "Just beyond that ridge." The cabin appeared suddenly nestled against the hillside like it had grown there naturally. Built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney, it was small but sturdy, designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters. Jed helped Abby dismount, steadying her when her injured feet made her stumble. "It's not much," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "But it's safe. Few people even know it exists." "Whose is it?" she asked, studying the structure with cautious interest. "It belonged to an old trapper named McCready," Jed explained as he unsaddled Samson. "Taught me everything I know about tracking. He died 2 winters ago, left it to me in a letter I received months after his passing." The interior of the cabin was simple but well-maintained. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. The air was cool and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke from fires long extinguished. Jed busied himself lighting the lamps and starting a fire, while Abby stood just inside the doorway, seemingly uncertain of her place in this unexpected sanctuary. "You should rest," Jed said, gesturing toward the bed once the fire was crackling steadily. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated. "And where will you sleep?" "I've got a bedroll. The floor suits me fine." He moved to a trunk near the fireplace and extracted a clean shirt, offering it to her. "You might want to change. There's water in the basin for washing." Abby accepted the shirt with a nod of thanks. As she moved toward the basin, Jed tactfully stepped outside to tend to Samson, giving her privacy. The night air was crisp with the promise of frost by morning. Jed led Samson to a small lean-to beside the cabin where he brushed the stallion down and provided water and feed. The rhythmic motion of the brush across the horse's coat was soothing, allowing his mind to process the day's extraordinary events. He had returned to Valley Creek to visit his family's graves, perhaps to finally close that chapter of his life and move on. Instead, he found himself drawn into a dangerous conflict with the town's most powerful figure, protecting a woman he barely knew, but whose cause resonated deeply with his own unresolved pain. Jed touched the wound on the back of his head, finding it had mostly stopped bleeding. His ribs ached where Miller's boot had connected, but nothing seemed broken. He'd suffered far worse injuries in the war and on the trail. When he finally returned to the cabin, he found Abby seated at the table, his shirt hanging loosely on her smaller frame. She had washed the dirt from her face and hands and combed her dark hair back with her fingers. The bruise on her cheekbone stood out starkly against her now clean skin, a purple-blue reminder of the violence she had endured. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but no longer hostile. "Your head needs tending," she stated matter-of-factly. Jed nodded, retrieving his medical kit from the saddlebags he'd brought in earlier. He sat in the chair opposite her and handed her the supplies. With gentle efficiency, Abby cleaned the wound, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "You were lucky," she commented. "Another inch lower, and it might have fractured your skull." "Wouldn't be the first time," Jed replied wryly. "You've had a hard life, haven't you, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, applying a salve to the cleaned wound. "Jed," he corrected, "and no harder than most who survived the war." She finished her ministrations and returned the supplies to the kit. "My father was a chaplain during the conflict. He never spoke much of what he saw, but the nightmares told their own story." Jed studied her face in the warm glow of the firelight. Despite the bruises and the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, there was a strength in her features that spoke of resilience rather than hardness. "You mentioned he taught you to defend yourself. Unusual for a pastor." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "My father believed that God gave us the wisdom to avoid trouble, but also the strength to face it when necessary. He taught me to read, to think, and yes, to throw a stone with accuracy." The smile faded. "After my mother died of fever when I was 12, he raised me alone. Said I needed to be twice as capable as any man if I was to make my way in this world." "He sounds like a wise man." He was. Grief flickered across her face before she composed herself. "And now Patterson will pay for what he did to him. To Marshall Weaver. To all the people he's wronged." The conviction in her voice was unmistakable, but Jed recognized the danger in such single-minded pursuit of vengeance. He had walked that path himself after losing Elizabeth and Sarah, and it had nearly destroyed what remained of his soul. "Justice is what matters," he said carefully, "not revenge. There's a difference." Abby's eyes flashed. "Is there when the law itself is corrupted by men like Patterson? What difference remains between justice and vengeance?" It was a fair question, one Jed had wrestled with during his darkest days. "Intent," he answered finally. "Justice seeks to restore balance. Revenge seeks only to inflict pain equal to what was suffered." She considered this, her gaze drifting to the dancing flames in the fireplace. "And which are you seeking, Jed Calloway?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully explore. Before Jed could formulate a response, Abby swayed slightly in her chair, fatigue finally overwhelming her determination. "You need rest," he said, rising and guiding her gently toward the bed. "We can discuss philosophy and revenge when you're stronger." Too exhausted to argue, Abby allowed herself to be led to the narrow bed. As she settled beneath the rough woolen blanket, she looked up at Jed with a vulnerability that hadn't been present before. "What if they find us here?" she asked, her voice small against the crackling of the fire. Jed checked his revolver before returning it to its holster. "They won't, but if they did, they'd regret it." He moved to extinguish the lamp beside the bed. "Sleep now. You're safe." As Abby's eyes closed, surrendering to exhaustion, Jed settled into the chair by the fire, Winchester across his knees. Outside, an owl called into the night, its mournful cry echoing across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered. Jed stared into the flames, contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought him to this moment. 7 years of solitary existence driven by grief, and the mechanical pursuit of justice through bounty hunting had suddenly been interrupted by a woman with eyes that burned with the same loss he carried in his own heart. Whatever lay ahead, whatever danger Patterson might bring to their door, one thing was certain: Jed would not fail Abby Hayes as he had failed his family. This time, he would be there to protect what mattered, whatever the cost. The flames danced lower as the night deepened, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Jed remained vigilant, a solitary sentinel against the darkness, while Abby slept the exhausted sleep of one who had found, perhaps for the first time in many weeks, a moment of true safety. Dawn broke over the mountains in shades of amber and gold, filtering through the cabin's single window to cast long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Jed had maintained his vigil through the night, dozing occasionally but never fully surrendering to sleep. Now, as the first light touched Abby's face, he watched her stir, noting how different she looked in repose, younger, unburdened by the weight of grief and fear that had marked her features the previous day. Her eyes opened suddenly, instantly alert. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then her gaze found Jed, and remembrance returned. "You stayed awake all night," she observed, her voice still rough with sleep. Jed rose from his chair, stretching muscles stiff from the long hours of stillness. "Force of habit," he replied. "I've learned to function on little sleep." Abby sat up, wincing slightly as she swung her feet to the floor. The borrowed shirt hung loosely from her shoulders, a stark contrast to the tattered dress she had worn the day before. "How's your head?" Jed touched the wound gingerly. "I'll live. How are your feet?" She examined them carefully, peeling back the socks he had given her. The abrasions looked angry, but clean, with no signs of infection. "Better than yesterday. Thank you for the treatment." He nodded and moved to the small stove in the corner, stoking the fire that had burned low overnight. "There's jerky and coffee," he said. "Not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep us going until we can find something better." As Jed prepared the simple meal, Abby rose and moved to the basin, washing her face and hands before attempting to bring some order to her tangled hair. The domestic routine felt strangely normal in the midst of their extraordinary circumstances. They ate in companionable silence, the coffee hot and strong, the jerky tough but nourishing. Through the window, the forest was coming alive with morning sounds: birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the soft sigh of wind through pine needles. "What happens now?" Abby asked, finally setting down her empty cup. Jed considered the question, weighing their limited options. "Patterson will have men watching the main roads and settlements. We need supplies, clothing for you, but we can't risk the nearby towns." "There's a trading post about 15 miles south," Abby suggested. run by a Ute family. My father used to visit them occasionally. They might help us." Jed raised an eyebrow, impressed by her knowledge. "Do you know the way?" She nodded. "I've made the journey several times with my father. The Browns are good people, unlikely to have any connection to Patterson." "Then that's our first destination," Jed decided. "But our larger problem remains. Patterson won't stop hunting you as long as you pose a threat to him." Abby's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we need to find the proof that will expose him. Make it impossible for him to hide behind his position." "What kind of proof?" "Before he died, my father was collecting evidence of Patterson's land fraud scheme. Documents, witness testimonies, copies of falsified deeds." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "He kept everything in a hidden compartment beneath the church altar." Jed frowned. "If Patterson killed your father, wouldn't he have searched the church?" "Of course," Abby confirmed. "But the compartment was my father's secret. He showed it to me when I was just a child, made me promise never to reveal it to anyone. It's where he kept the church's valuables and his most private papers." "And you believe this evidence is still there?" "If Patterson didn't find it, yes." A shadow crossed her face. "It's my only hope of bringing him to justice, of making my father's death mean something." Jed studied her, recognizing the dangerous mixture of grief and determination that drove her. He had walked that same path after losing his family, allowing the need for answers to consume him until little else remained. "Going back to Valley Creek would be extremely dangerous," he said carefully. "Patterson will have men watching for us. The church itself might be under surveillance." "I know the risks," Abby replied, her voice steady. "But what choice do we have? Run forever, live in fear of being found." "I can't do that, Jed. I won't." The conviction in her voice struck a chord in him. How many years had he spent moving from town to town, bounty to bounty, never staying long enough to form connections to build anything lasting? It was existence, not living. And it had brought him no closer to peace or to answers about his family's deaths. "We'll need a plan," he said finally. "A way to get into town undetected, retrieve the evidence, and get out again without being caught." Relief softened Abby's features. "Thank you," she said simply. Jed stood collecting their empty cups. "Don't thank me yet. First let's get those supplies, then we can work out how to infiltrate a town that wants us dead." The trading post was little more than a large cabin, with an attached stable set in a clearing beside a swift-flowing creek. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, and several horses were tethered outside, suggesting the presence of other customers. Jed reined Samson to a halt at the edge of the trees, surveying the scene with a bounty hunter's caution. "Wait here," he instructed Abby, who sat behind him on the horse. "Let me make sure it's safe." She nodded, sliding down from the saddle with more ease than the previous day, her feet having benefited from rest and treatment. Jed dismounted and handed her the reins, then drew his revolver, checking it, before returning it to his holster. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, or if you hear gunshots, take Samson and ride north. There's another cabin about 5 miles up the valley. You'll find supplies there to last a few days." "I'm not leaving you behind," Abby stated firmly. Jed gave her a stern look. "This isn't a debate. If something happens to me, your priority is to stay alive and get that evidence. Understood?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded reluctantly. Satisfied, Jed made his way toward the trading post, approaching from an angle that gave him a clear view of both the entrance and the surrounding area. As he neared, the door opened and 2 men emerged, engaged in conversation. Jed tensed his hand, moving instinctively toward his holster, but the men mounted their horses and rode off in the opposite direction without giving him a second glance. Taking that as a positive sign, Jed continued to the entrance and stepped inside. The interior was dim after the bright morning sunlight, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The trading post was well stocked with provisions, tools, clothing, and sundry items needed for frontier life. Behind a rough-hewn counter stood a middle-aged Native American man with graying hair tied back neatly, his expression impassive as he assessed the newcomer. "Morning," Jed greeted, keeping his posture relaxed, despite his inner alertness. The man nodded in acknowledgement. "What can I help you with, friend?" "Need some supplies," Jed replied. "Food, ammunition, clothing." He glanced around, noting they were alone in the store. "And information if you're willing to sell it." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Information costs more than goods these days. Depends on what you're looking for." "I'm looking for trouble, or rather, how to avoid it," Jed clarified. "Specifically the kind that comes from Valley Creek." The man studied Jed for a long moment, his gaze taking in the travel dust, the recent head wound, and the vigilant posture of someone accustomed to watching his back. "You're Calloway," he stated, rather than asked. "The bounty hunter." Jed tensed his hand, drifting closer to his holster. "You have me at a disadvantage." "Joseph Brown," the man introduced himself. "And you can relax. If I meant you harm, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He leaned forward slightly. "Word travels fast in these parts. Judge Patterson has men searching for you and a woman, offering good money for information." "And yet, you haven't called for those men," Jed observed. A ghost of a smile touched Brown's lips. "Patterson and I have what you might call a difference of opinion regarding who owns this land. He believes his papers give him the right to it. I believe my family's 100 years here counts for more." Jed began to understand. "He's tried to take your trading post." "3 times, Brown confirmed. "First with offers, then with threats, finally with fraudulent deeds claiming this has always been territory granted to the Valley Creek Township." "Why hasn't he succeeded?" Brown's smile widened slightly. "Because unlike many others, I have connections in Denver who recognize the legitimacy of my family's claim. And because those who come to enforce his will often find themselves facing more resistance than they anticipated." As if to emphasize his point, the beaded curtain behind the counter parted, and a young Native American man emerged, a shotgun held casually but competently in his hands. He nodded respectfully to Jed before taking up a position near the window. "My son Thomas," Brown introduced. "West Point graduate, served with distinction in the Army before returning to help defend our home." Jed reassessed the situation, sensing potential allies rather than threats. "I have someone with me," he said. "Abigail Hayes. She witnessed Patterson murder Marshall Weaver." Recognition flashed in Brown's eyes. "Reverend Hayes's daughter. We heard she'd been imprisoned." "She was, until yesterday." Jed briefly explained the events at the courthouse and their subsequent escape. "She believes her father collected evidence of Patterson's crimes, evidence that could bring him down if we can retrieve it." Brown and his son exchanged glances. "Reverend Hayes was a good man," Brown said solemnly. "One of the few who treated my people with respect. If his daughter needs sanctuary, she'll find it here." Relief eased some of the tension in Jed's shoulders. "Thank you. I'll bring her in." When Jed returned with Abby, the Browns welcomed her with genuine warmth. Thomas's wife, Sarah, a gentle-faced woman with intelligent eyes, immediately took charge of seeing to Abby's needs, providing her with clean clothing, proper boots, and a private space to change and rest. Meanwhile, Joseph Brown showed Jed to a back room where they could speak freely. A rough map of the territory was spread on a table weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones. "Patterson's influence extends throughout this region," Brown explained, tracing a circle that encompassed Valley Creek, and several surrounding settlements. He has the sheriff's office, the land commission, and most local businesses under his control. Even the stage lines report to him when strangers arrive or depart. How did one man amass so much power? Jed asked, studying the map. The war left many voids in leadership, Brown replied. Patterson came with Eastern money and connections, presented himself as a man of law and order during chaotic times. By the time people realized his true nature, he'd already secured his position. Jed's finger traced the route back to Valley Creek. We need to get into town undetected, retrieve evidence from the church, and get out again without being caught. Brown considered this challenge thoughtfully. The main roads will be watched, he agreed. But there are older paths, hunting trails, used by my people long before the town existed. He indicated a winding route that approached Valley Creek from the northwest. This trail comes in behind the church cemetery. Overgrown now, but still passable, if you know the way. Can you guide us? Jed asked. Better, Brown replied. Thomas can take you. He knows every inch of that trail, and he's skilled enough to keep you both safe. Why would he take such a risk for strangers? Brown's expression turned grave. Because Patterson's corruption threatens all of us, and because, he added, lowering his voice, Thomas's sister was married to a settler whose land Patterson seized last year. When her husband protested, he was found hanging from a tree, allegedly for horse theft. She died of grief weeks later, leaving their children in our care. The personal cost of Patterson's crimes became clearer with each new revelation. It wasn't just Abby and Jed who had suffered. The judge's corruption had touched countless lives, torn apart families, stolen futures. I'm sorry for your loss, Jed said sincerely, and grateful for your help. Brown nodded in acknowledgement. We'll provision you, properly provide what information we can. Thomas will guide you to the church under cover of darkness. After that, your fate rests in your own hands and the grace of the Creator. Later, as Jed sat on the trading post's covered porch cleaning, his Winchester Abby joined him, transformed by her change of clothing. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, sturdy boots on her feet, and her dark hair was neatly braided down her back. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, but somehow less defining now that the rest of her appearance spoke of dignity rather than mistreatment. You look better, Jed observed, setting aside his rifle. I feel better, she admitted, settling beside him on the rough bench. Sarah has been very kind. She even gave me this. Abby held up a small revolver well-maintained and sized for a woman's hand. She insisted I should have a way to defend myself. Jed nodded approvingly. Do you know how to use it? My father taught me the basics, she replied, though I've never fired at anything but targets. Taking a human life changes you, Jed said quietly. Even when necessary, it leaves a mark on your soul. Abby studied his face, reading the experience etched there. You've killed many men. It wasn't a question, but Jed answered anyway. In the war, yes, and some after, when my duty as a bounty hunter required it. I don't take pride in it. Yet, you continue in that profession. Jed gazed out at the forested slopes surrounding the trading post, considering her implied question. After Elizabeth and Sarah died, I needed a purpose. Bringing criminals to justice seemed straightforward, right and wrong clearly defined. No complications, no attachments. And now, Abby asked, her voice gentle but probing. Jed met her gaze, struck again by the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that had endured despite all she had suffered. Now I'm not sure of anything, except that Patterson needs to be stopped. They sat in companionable silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. From inside the trading post came the domestic sounds of dinner preparation, a reminder of the normal life that continued even in the midst of their personal turmoil. "Joseph says we'll leave at midnight," Abby said finally. "Thomas knows a trail that will bring us to the church by dawn." Jed nodded. "It's a solid plan, but once we're there, the real danger begins." "Are you certain you want to go through with this?" "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied without hesitation. "My father died trying to expose Patterson's crimes. I owe it to him to finish what he started." The conviction in her voice was familiar to Jed, the same determination that had driven him to hunt bounties across the territory to maintain his solitary existence rather than risk losing anyone else he cared for. But where his path had led to isolation, Abby's had brought her here willing to risk everything for justice. "Then we'll see it done," he promised. "Together." As the word left his lips, Jed realized it had been many years since he'd considered himself part of any together. The awareness stirred something long dormant within him, a recognition that perhaps his path didn't have to remain solitary forever. Night shrouded the forest in velvet darkness, broken only by the faint silver of moonlight filtering through the canopy of pines. Thomas Brown led the way along an ancient trail barely visible to untrained eyes, moving with the silent confidence of one who knew the land intimately. Jed followed with Abby between them, their horses stepping carefully over the uneven ground. They had been traveling for hours, maintaining a steady pace that avoided the main roads while making good progress toward Valley Creek. Thomas had explained that the trail was once used by his ancestors for hunting and trading long before white settlers established the town. "My grandfather showed me these paths when I was a boy," he had told them as they set out. "Said to remember them because the day might come when our people needed to move unseen again." Now, as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, Thomas knelt to examine some tracks in the soft earth near the water's edge. Jed joined him, studying the impressions with a bounty hunter's trained eye. "Two riders," Jed observed quietly. "Heading east, recent within the last few hours." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Patterson's men, most likely, searching the outlying areas." "How much farther to the church?" Abby asked, keeping her voice low, despite the isolation of their position. 3 hours at this pace," Thomas replied. "We'll arrive just before dawn, the safest time to move. Most men, even guards, are at their least alert then." They remounted and continued their journey, the forest gradually giving way to more open terrain as they approached the outskirts of Valley Creek. Thomas led them on a circuitous route that skirted farmsteads and avoided the occasional cabin, always keeping to the shadows and natural cover provided by the landscape. As promised, the first pale light of dawn was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon when they reached the edge of the church cemetery. The white steeple rose against the fading stars, a lonely sentinel on the outskirts of town. From their position in a copse of trees, they could see. The church stood dark and seemingly unattended, the nearest houses still a good distance away. "I'll hold the horses here," Thomas whispered. "If there's trouble, I'll create a diversion to draw attention away from the church. Otherwise, I'll wait until you return." Jed clasped the man's shoulder in silent thanks, then turned to Abby. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "If we're separated, head back here immediately. Don't wait, don't try to help me. Get the evidence to Thomas and ride for Denver." She nodded, though the set of her jaw suggested she might not follow those instructions if Jed found himself in danger. Together, they made their way through the cemetery, moving from headstone to headstone, using the markers as cover. The church itself was a simple wooden structure built by the community some 15 years earlier, according to Abby. A small vestibule led into the main sanctuary with living quarters attached at the rear for the pastor's use. "There's a side door," Abby whispered, pointing to the eastern wall of the church. "It leads directly to the altar area." They approached cautiously, Jed's every sense alert for signs of a trap or surveillance. But the church remained still and silent, seemingly untouched since the tragedy that had claimed Reverend Hayes's life. The side door was locked, but Abby produced a small key from her pocket. "My father always made sure I had a way into God's house," she explained softly, as she turned the key in the lock. The door opened with a slight creak that seemed thunderous in the pre-dawn stillness. They froze, listening intently, but no response came. After a moment, they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The interior of the church was cool and dim, smelling of wood polish and candle wax. Filtered moonlight cast pale rectangles on the floor, through the stained glass windows illuminating the simple wooden pews and the altar at the front of the sanctuary. Abby moved directly to the altar, her steps sure, despite the low light. The altar itself was a solid wooden structure carved with symbols of faith: a cross, a chalice, an open Bible. She knelt before it, her fingers searching the underside of the table with practiced movements. Jed kept watch by the door, his revolver drawn, listening for any sound that might signal discovery. Outside, the sky was lightening gradually, the darkness giving way to the soft gray of early dawn. "Here," Abby whispered suddenly. A soft click followed, and a small section of the altar's front panel swung open, revealing a hidden compartment. Jed moved closer, watching as Abby reached into the space and extracted a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing a leather-bound ledger and several folded documents. "This is it," she breathed, a mixture of triumph and grief in her voice. "My father's evidence." Before Jed could respond, a floorboard creaked in the vestibule. Both froze, eyes meeting in silent alarm. Someone else was in the church. With practiced efficiency, Abby rewrapped the bundle and tucked it into her coat. Jed gestured for her to stay low behind the altar while he moved silently toward the source of the sound, his revolver held ready. The vestibule was empty, but the main door to the church stood slightly ajar. Jed was certain it had been closed when they entered. Someone had come in or gone out while they were focused on the altar. A whisper of movement behind him made Jed spin, his revolver raised. Martha, the church caretaker Abby had mentioned, stood in the doorway to the sanctuary, a broom clutched in her trembling hands. "Mr. Calloway." She gasped clearly, recognizing him despite the dim light. "What are you doing here?" Before Jed could decide how to respond, Abby emerged from behind the altar. "Martha," she said softly. "It's me, Abigail Hayes." The older woman's eyes widened in shock and what appeared to be genuine joy. "Miss Abby! Oh, thank the Lord!" She rushed forward, abandoning the broom, to embrace Abby with motherly affection. "We thought you were lost to us when they took you away." Jed lowered his weapon, but remained vigilant, uncertain whether Martha's appearance was as innocent as it seemed. "Does anyone else know you're here?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Martha released Abby and turned to him, wiping tears from her weathered cheeks. "No, sir. I come early each day to prepare the church. Been doing so since Reverend Hayes—" She broke off, glancing apologetically at Abby. "Since the tragedy." "Can we trust her?" Jed asked Abby directly. Abby nodded without hesitation. "Martha has been part of this church since before I was born. She helped my father with his charitable work, including sheltering those who had lost their land to Patterson." Martha's expression hardened at the judge's name. "That man has much to answer for," she said grimly, "both in this world and the next." "We have evidence of his crimes," Abby told her, patting the bundle beneath her coat. "My father's records of the land fraud witness testimonies, everything needed to bring him to justice." Hope and fear warred in Martha's eyes. "You're going to need help," she said. Patterson has men everywhere. The moment you try to leave town, they'll be on you. We have a friend waiting with horses, Jed explained. If we can get back to the cemetery without being seen, that won't be possible, Martha interrupted, moving to the window to peer out cautiously. Patterson's men are already surrounding the church. Jed joined her at the window, keeping to the shadows as he assessed the situation. Sure enough, several mounted men were visible at the edge of the cemetery, and more were approaching on foot from the direction of town. "How did they know we were here?" Abby asked, her voice tight with alarm. Martha's expression turned guilty. "I fear it may be my fault. When I arrived and found the side door unlocked, I went to check the altar Reverend Hayes always said to ensure it was properly prepared. When I found it disturbed, I ran to get help. I thought it was vandals or thieves." "Who did you tell?" Jed demanded. "Sheriff Reynolds," Martha admitted. "He's always been kind to me, even after—" She trailed off, her eyes widening in realization. He must have informed Patterson immediately. Jed's mind raced, calculating their dwindling options. The church was being surrounded, their escape route cut off. Even if they could fight their way out, the evidence might be lost or destroyed in the process. "Is there another way out?" he asked Martha urgently. The older woman hesitated, then nodded. "The tunnel." "Tunnel," both Jed and Abby echoed in surprise. "During the war, Reverend Hayes helped escaping slaves reach safety in the north," Martha explained. "He had a tunnel built from the church basement to an old mining shaft about half a mile away. Few know of its existence now." Hope flared within Jed. "Can you show us?" Martha nodded, already moving toward a door near the pulpit. "This way, quickly." As they followed her through the door and down a narrow staircase to the church basement, Jed caught Abby's arm. "If this is a trap," he began in a whisper. "It's not," Abby assured him. "Martha wouldn't betray us. And I remember my father mentioning a path to freedom beneath the church, though he never showed it to me. And the basement was cool and musty, filled with stored church supplies, old furniture, and boxes of hymn books." Martha led them to what appeared to be a solid stone wall at the far end, where she pressed on a specific stone. A section of the wall swung inward with a grinding sound, revealing a dark passage beyond. "It hasn't been used in years," Martha warned, lighting a lantern that hung on a hook just inside the entrance. "But it should still be passable." Shouts from above indicated Patterson's men had entered the church. They had minutes at most before the basement was discovered. "Thank you, Martha," Abby said, embracing the older woman once more. "You've risked much to help us." "Go with God, child," Martha replied, pressing the lantern into Abby's hands. "And bring that devil Patterson to justice." Jed ushered Abby into the tunnel, then turned back to Martha. "What will you tell them?" "That I was checking the basement for intruders and found nothing," she replied with surprising steadiness. "They won't harm an old woman who's known for her simple faith and poor eyesight." With a final nod of thanks, Jed entered the tunnel. Martha sealed the entrance behind them, leaving them in the close darkness illuminated only by the wavering light of the lantern. The passage was narrow and low, forcing Jed to hunch his tall frame as they moved forward. The earthen walls were supported by timber beams at regular intervals, the floor packed dirt that muffled their footsteps. The air was stale but breathable, carrying the scent of soil and old wood. "How far did she say it was?" Jed asked in a hushed voice. "Half a mile," Abby replied, holding the lantern higher to illuminate the path ahead. "To an abandoned mining shaft." They moved as quickly as the confined space allowed, aware that their discovery could come at any moment, if Martha's deception failed, or if Patterson's men somehow knew of the tunnel's existence. The sounds from the church faded behind them, replaced by the eerie silence of the underground passage. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes, the tunnel began to slope upward. Ahead, dim natural light filtered down from above, suggesting they were approaching the exit. "We're close," Abby whispered, her voice tight with anticipation. Jed moved ahead of her, taking the lead as the tunnel widened into what was clearly an old mining chamber. Rotting support beams stood at odd angles, and rusted equipment lay abandoned on the ground. At the far end, a shaft of morning light indicated the way out. Cautiously, Jed approached the exit, which was partially concealed by overgrown brush. He peered through the foliage, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of Patterson's men. The shaft emerged in a small ravine some distance from the church, with no buildings visible nearby. "It looks clear," he reported, "but we'll need to move quickly. Thomas and the horses are still back at the cemetery." Abby's face fell as she realized the implications. "We're cut off from our escape route." "We'll find another way," Jed assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at him. They were on foot in unfamiliar territory, with Patterson's men likely searching every inch of the area by now. They emerged from the mine shaft, blinking in the morning sunlight that now illuminated the landscape. The ravine provided some cover, but they would be exposed once they climbed its walls. "Which way?" Abby asked, clutching the precious bundle of evidence tightly against her chest. Jed oriented himself, identifying the direction of the church, then pointed southwest. "The trading post is that way, but it's a long journey on foot, and we'd be crossing open country for much of it." Before Abby could respond, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Jed pulled her back into the partial cover of the mine entrance, his hand going to his revolver. The hoofbeats grew louder, approaching the ravine from the east. "Get back inside," Jed whispered urgently. "If it's Patterson's men—" "Wait!" Abby interrupted, her eyes fixed on the ridge above them. "Look!" A lone rider appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the morning sky. Even at this distance, Jed recognized the straight posture and distinctive hat of Thomas Brown. "Thomas," Abby breathed in relief. "But how did he find us?" The young man guided his horse carefully down the ravine's slope, leading two other mounts behind him. As he drew closer, his expression was grim but determined. "I saw them surround the church," he explained without preamble as he reached them. "Figured you'd need another way out. My grandfather once told me about a mine connected to the church, a secret path from darker days." "Your grandfather knew about the tunnel?" Abby asked in surprise. Thomas nodded. "He helped build it. Many of my people did, working alongside Reverend Hayes during the war." He handed them the reins to the other horses. "We need to move. Patterson's men are searching in ever-widening circles from the church." As they mounted, Jed noticed Thomas favoring his left arm. "You're injured," he observed. Thomas grimaced. "Had a disagreement with two of Patterson's men who got too close to our horses. They won't be following us." The implication was clear, and Jed felt a new respect for the young man's resolve. "Which way?" he asked. "Not back to the trading post," Thomas decided. "They'll check there first. I know another place, an old trapper's cabin my uncle used to use. It's well hidden about 10 miles west in the foothills." With Thomas again taking the lead, they rode out of the ravine and into the forest beyond, keeping to cover whenever possible and maintaining a pace that balanced speed with caution. The morning sun rose higher, burning away the mist that had provided additional concealment during their exit from the tunnel. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Thomas suddenly raised his hand in a signal to halt. Jed and Abby reined in their mounts, listening intently. The forest had gone quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals. Something had disturbed the natural rhythm of the wilderness. Thomas pointed to a ridge about half a mile ahead. Even at this distance, Jed could make out the movement of riders traversing the hillside, methodically searching the terrain. Patterson's men, Thomas confirmed in a whisper. They're between us and the cabin. How many? Jed asked, already counting the figures he could see. At least 6 on the ridge, Thomas replied. Probably more we can't see yet. Abby's face showed determination rather than fear. Is there another route to the cabin? Thomas considered for a moment, then nodded. A longer path following the creek to the north before cutting west again. It will add hours to our journey, but it might allow us to circle around them. Or we could split up, Jed suggested grimly. Create a diversion. I could draw them off while you two continue to the cabin with the evidence. Abby's response was immediate and firm. No, we stay together. Thomas nodded in agreement. Divided, we're vulnerable. Together, we have a better chance if it comes to a fight. He gestured toward a dense thicket of pines to their left. Through there. The creek lies beyond. We'll have to move carefully. The ground is rocky, and sound carries in these hills. They dismounted and led their horses through the thicket, each step measured to minimize noise. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles that muffled their movements, but the occasional snap of a twig or clatter of a dislodged stone seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. The creek, when they reached it, was shallow but swift, its bed lined with smooth stones polished by years of flowing water. Thomas led them into the creek itself, the horses stepping carefully through the ankle-deep current. The water will hide our tracks, he explained softly, and the sound of the stream will mask our movements. They followed the creek northward for nearly 2 miles, the cold water numbing their feet and legs, but providing the concealment they desperately needed. Finally, Thomas guided them out of the water at a point where the creek bent sharply east, continuing their journey on a game trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The sun was high overhead when they stopped to rest in a small clearing, allowing the horses to drink from a spring that bubbled up between moss-covered rocks. Jed kept watch while Abby and Thomas ate some of the dried meat and bread they had brought from the trading post. "Let me see that arm," Abby said to Thomas, noticing how he winced when reaching for his canteen. Reluctantly, Thomas rolled up his sleeve to reveal a long slash across his forearm, crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth, now stained with dried blood. Abby examined it with practiced care, then cleaned and rebandaged the wound using supplies from the small medical kit Jed carried. "You're good at that," Thomas observed as she finished. "My father believed in practical education," Abby replied with a small smile. "He taught me basic medicine alongside scripture and literature." "He was a wise man," Thomas said. "My father speaks of him with great respect." Jed, listening to their conversation while maintaining his vigilant watch, found himself wondering about the life Abby had led before Patterson's actions had torn it apart. The daughter of a respected pastor, educated beyond what was common for frontier women, clearly beloved by those who knew her. What future might she have had if tragedy hadn't intervened? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant but unmistakable sound of a hunting horn, a signal used by trackers to communicate when spread across wide terrain. Thomas rose immediately, his expression grave. "They're coordinating their search," he said, "and they're closer than I'd like." They quickly gathered their supplies and remounted, abandoning the relative comfort of the clearing for the uncertainty of the trail ahead. Thomas led them up a steep incline, the horses laboring on the sharply rising ground. From the top, they could see much of the surrounding countryside and the small groups of riders methodically searching it, moving in a pattern that suggested experience and organization. "Patterson has more men than I expected," Jed noted grimly. "He must have called in help from nearby settlements." "Or hired guns," Thomas added. "There are always men willing to kill for the right price." Abby studied the distant figures with a mixture of fear and determination. They're preventing us from reaching Denver with the evidence. That's exactly their purpose, Jed agreed. Patterson knows what we have. He'll do anything to keep it from reaching the territorial authorities. Thomas pointed to a deep valley that cut through the mountains to the northwest. The cabin lies there about 3 hours' ride if we push hard, but we'll be exposed crossing that open ridge first. Jed assessed their options, weighing the risks against the fading daylight. Soon, they would lose the advantage of visibility, but darkness would bring its own dangers in this unfamiliar, rugged terrain. We'll have to chance it, he decided. Wait for those riders to move past that far stand of pines, then make our crossing as quickly as possible. They watched in tense silence as the nearest group of searchers moved slowly through the area Thomas had indicated. Minutes stretched like hours, the sun inching toward the western horizon as they waited for their opportunity. Finally, the riders disappeared behind a fold in the landscape, temporarily out of sight. "Now!" Jed urged, and they urged their mounts forward, emerging from cover onto the exposed ridge. The crossing took less than 5 minutes, but each second felt precarious, their figures silhouetted against the sky for anyone with a spyglass to see. They reached the shelter of the tree line on the far side without raising an alarm, but Jed knew their luck might not hold much longer. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they descended into the valley, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses down particularly steep sections. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped lower, the forest growing darker beneath the dense canopy of pine and spruce. "Not much further," Thomas assured them as they navigated a narrow passage between towering rock formations. "The cabin is hidden in a grove just beyond that next rise." Jed felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly at this news. They had evaded Patterson's men thus far, and the prospect of shelter, rest, and time to examine the evidence Abby carried offered a glimmer of hope in their desperate situation. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a hunter's shelter, a single room with a stone fireplace, its logs weathered by years of mountain storms. But its walls were solid, its roof intact, and its location perfectly concealed by surrounding trees and a natural hollow in the landscape that hid any smoke from a fire. Thomas tended to the horses while Jed secured the perimeter, checking for any signs that others had recently visited the cabin. Satisfied that they were alone, he joined Abby inside, where she had already started a small fire in the fireplace, its light casting warm shadows on the rough wooden walls. "We should be safe here for tonight," he told her, setting his rifle within easy reach by the door. "Thomas will take first watch. I'll relieve him in a few hours." Abby nodded, then carefully removed the oilcloth bundle from inside her coat, placing it on the cabin's single table. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing the leather-bound ledger and documents her father had collected. This is everything he gathered," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "All the evidence of Patterson's crimes, his legacy." Jed moved to stand beside her, conscious of the significance of this moment. Together they opened the ledger, finding page after page of meticulous notes in Reverend Hayes's careful handwriting. Names, dates, descriptions of fraudulent land transactions, maps showing the original property boundaries and how they had been altered in official records, statements from witnesses, many now deceased or driven from the territory. He was thorough, Jed observed, impressed by the detail and organization of the evidence. "My father believed that truth required precision," Abby replied, turning another page, "that justice depended on leaving no room for doubt." As they continued through the ledger, a pattern emerged, one that made Jed's blood run cold. Patterson's land seizures weren't random acts of greed. They followed a deliberate path, creating a corridor of properties stretching from Valley Creek to the territorial capital. The railroad, Jed realized, seeing the pattern clearly now. He's acquiring land along the proposed railway route. Abby nodded grimly. My father suspected as much. The government pays handsomely for land needed for the transcontinental connection. By fraudulently obtaining these properties, first, Patterson stands to make a fortune when he sells them to the railway company. And anyone who stands in his way, Jed began, meets with an accident. Abby finished, her voice hard, like Marshall Weaver, like my father. A terrible suspicion formed in Jed's mind as he studied the map of affected properties. Show me where my old homestead was located. He requested, his throat suddenly dry. Abby turned to one of the final pages where a detailed map showed the eastern approach to Valley Creek. Jed's finger traced the familiar boundaries of what had once been his land, where he had built a home for Elizabeth and Sarah Land that had been sold after their deaths when Heap couldn't bear to return to it. There, marked clearly in Reverend Hayes's hand, was his former property, now registered to a holding company controlled by Harrison Patterson. He took your land, too, Abby said softly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Jed's mind raced back 7 years to the fire that had claimed his family while he was away hunting a bounty. An accident, they had called it. A tragic accident. It wasn't an accident, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The fire that killed my wife and daughter. It was Patterson. The realization struck him like a physical blow, confirmation of a suspicion he had carried in the darkest corners of his mind for years. His family hadn't died by chance, they had been murdered as part of Patterson's methodical acquisition of land for his railway scheme. Abby placed her hand over his where it rested on the map. I'm so sorry, Jed. He looked up from the map to meet her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same grief, the same anger that now burned within him. 2 families destroyed by one man's greed. 2 lives derailed by calculated violence disguised as misfortune. We'll make him pay, Jed vowed, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. Not just for your father or for my family, but for everyone whose life he's destroyed. Abby's hand tightened over his. Justice, not revenge, she reminded him, gently echoing his own words from the previous night. Justice, Jed agreed, though the line between the two had never seemed thinner. Thomas entered the cabin, then bringing with him the cool evening air and a bundle of additional firewood. He sensed the charged atmosphere, immediately looking between them with concern. What is it? He asked. What have you found? Jed straightened, drawing a deep breath to compose himself. Evidence that Patterson's land seizures are part of a railway speculation scheme, and confirmation that he's responsible for multiple murders, including my family's. Thomas's expression hardened. Then we have what we need to destroy him. The question is, how do we get this evidence to someone who can act on it? It was the critical question, the one that had been at the heart of their desperate flight from Valley Creek. Patterson's influence extended throughout the local region. To find justice, they would need to reach higher authorities in Denver, officials beyond the judge's corrupt reach. The stage to Denver leaves from Silverton in 2 days, Thomas said, setting down the firewood. It's a larger settlement, less directly under Patterson's control. If we could reach it undetected. Patterson will have men watching all the regular transportation routes, Jed pointed out. And we're being hunted across the countryside as we speak. A thoughtful silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Abby turned back to the ledger, running her fingers gently over her father's handwriting. There may be another way, she said finally. My father mentioned a territorial judge who visited Valley Creek last year, Judge Samuel Harrington. He seemed genuinely concerned about some of the complaints he heard, though Patterson managed to prevent any formal investigation. Where is this Judge Harrington now? Jed asked. According to my father's notes, he presides in a circuit that includes Silver Falls, about 30 miles southwest of here. Abby flipped through the ledger until she found the relevant entry. If we could reach him directly, bypass Patterson's men and the local authorities entirely, and Thomas nodded slowly. Silver Falls is in the opposite direction from where they're searching. They wouldn't expect us to head further away from Denver. Hope, cautious but real, began to take root in Jed's mind. If this judge is as honest as Reverend Hayes believed, he could issue warrants for Patterson's arrest that even the local sheriff couldn't ignore. It's worth the risk, Abby declared, her conviction evident in the set of her jaw. Judge Harrington was kind to my father, listened to his concerns when others wouldn't. I believe he'll help us if we can reach him. The decision made, they spent the next hour planning their route to Silver Falls, using Thomas's knowledge of the terrain and the maps in Reverend Hayes's ledger. The journey would be challenging, crossing rugged mountains and open valleys, but with careful navigation and continued vigilance, it seemed possible. As night settled fully over the cabin, Thomas took the first watch outside, leaving Jed and Abby alone with the evidence and their shared grief. Exhaustion was evident in every line of Abby's body, the days of tension and physical exertion taking their toll despite her determined spirit. "You should rest," Jed told her gently. "We have a difficult journey ahead." She nodded, but made no move toward the cabin's single cot. Instead, she remained seated at the table, her fingers still tracing the pages of her father's ledger. "I keep thinking about what he must have felt," she said softly, knowing the danger gathering this evidence piece by piece, aware that Patterson might discover him at any moment. She looked up at Jed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Was he afraid? Did he suffer at the end? The questions were ones Jed had asked himself countless times about Elizabeth and Sarah. Had they been afraid? Had they suffered? The uncertainty was its own special torment. He moved to sit beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was a man of faith and courage. Whatever happened in his final moments, I believe he faced it with the same dignity he showed in life." A single tear slipped down Abby's cheek. "I wasn't there," she whispered. "I was visiting a sick parishioner in the next settlement. If I had been home—" "Then you might have died too," Jed said gently but firmly. "And the truth your father died to protect would have died with you." She wiped away the tear with a determined gesture. "You're right, and I won't let his sacrifice be in vain." Rising from the table, she moved to the cot, fatigue finally overcoming her desire to keep vigil with her father's work. "Wake me when it's my turn to watch." Jed nodded, though he had no intention of disturbing her much-needed rest. After she had settled on the cot, he returned to the ledger, studying the evidence more carefully, committing key details to memory in case they were separated from the physical documents. The pattern of Patterson's crimes was even more extensive than he had initially realized. Beyond the land seizures and associated murders, there were records of bribery, extortion, and manipulation of local elections. The judge had constructed a web of corruption that extended throughout the territory, all while maintaining the public facade of a respected jurist committed to law and order. As Jed turned another page, a folded letter slipped out different from the official documents and statements that comprised most of the evidence. Opening it carefully, he recognized Reverend Hayes's handwriting, but this was no legal testimony or careful documentation. It was a personal letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this evidence." With a glance to ensure Abby was sleeping, Jed began to read. "If you are reading this letter, then I have likely gone to meet my Maker, and the evidence I have gathered about Judge Harrison Patterson's crimes rests in your hands. I write these words not knowing who might find them, but praying that God will guide this information to someone with the courage to use it justly. I began this investigation after witnessing the suffering of my parishioners who lost their lands through what appeared to be legal means, but which I came to recognize as systematic fraud. What I discovered was far worse than mere financial malfeasance. It was calculated evil perpetrated by a man who has used his position of authority to commit murder while remaining above suspicion. I am not the first to attempt to expose Patterson's crimes. 7 years ago, a woman named Elizabeth Calloway began asking questions about strange alterations to property records after several of her neighbors were forced from their lands. Her husband, Jedediah, was away at the time, working as a bounty hunter in Wyoming Territory. Before he could return, Elizabeth and their young daughter Sarah perished in a fire that consumed their home, a fire that I now believe was deliberately set on Patterson's orders. Should Providence bring this evidence to Jedediah Calloway, I pray it might bring him the answers he has sought, and the peace that has eluded him. And should it come to my own daughter Abigail, I ask that she remember my teachings about the difference between justice and vengeance. The former heals, the latter only inflicts new wounds. May God guide whoever reads these words to use this evidence in service of truth and justice, and may He protect you from the dangers that will surely follow. With faith in His mercy. Reverend Michael Hayes. Jed sat oceanless, the letter trembling slightly in his hands as he processed what he had just read. Elizabeth had known. She had been investigating Patterson's scheme, perhaps planning to take her findings to the authorities. And for that, she and innocent Sarah had been murdered. He looked across the cabin at Abby's sleeping form, seeing in her the echo of her father's courage and principles. Two families connected by tragedy, now united in the search for justice. It seemed almost providential, as Reverend Hayes might have said. Carefully folding the letter, Jed placed it back within the ledger, deciding that Abby should read her father's final thoughts when she was rested. For now, he would keep watch, guarding both her and the precious evidence that represented their best hope for justice, and perhaps eventually for healing. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of the wilderness, the call of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the whispering of wind through pine needles. Somewhere in that darkness, Patterson's men continued their search, drawing ever closer to the hidden cabin. But for this moment, in this small sanctuary, there was a fragile peace, and the first stirrings of something Jed had not felt in years, purpose, beyond mere survival and connection to something larger than his solitary grief. Thomas's voice came softly from the doorway. All quiet outside. No sign of pursuit. Jed nodded, gathering his rifle as he prepared to take his turn at watch. Get some rest. We leave for Silver Falls at first light. As he stepped into the cool night air, stars blazing overhead in the clear mountain sky, Jed felt a strange sense of calm, despite the dangers that surrounded them. Whatever came next, whether justice or further trials, he was no longer facing it alone. And in that realization was a kind of peace he had thought lost forever. Dawn broke over the mountains in a wash of pale gold, illuminating the frost that had settled over the landscape during the night. Jed stood outside the cabin watching as the first light touched the distant peaks, transforming them from shadowy sentinels to gleaming monuments against the brightening sky. The cold air burned in his lungs, a sharp reminder of the living world around him. Thomas joined him, his breath forming clouds in the chill morning air. No sign of riders, he reported quietly. But we should move soon. They'll widen their search once they realize we've evaded them. Jed nodded, his mind already mapping the day's journey. Silver Falls lay southwest, a challenging ride through terrain that would provide both cover and obstacles. If they pushed hard, they might reach it by nightfall tomorrow. Abby's awake, Thomas added, preparing the last of our provisions for the journey. Inside the cabin, Abby had indeed risen and was efficiently packing their meager supplies. The evidence ledger and documents were already securely wrapped and stowed in a saddlebag. She looked up as Jed entered, and he was struck by the transformation in her appearance since their first meeting at the courthouse steps. Though still bearing the fading bruise on her cheek, she stood straight and purposeful, her eyes clear and determined. "I found my father's letter," she said, simply meeting his gaze. Jed paused, uncertain how to respond. He had intended to show her the letter when the time was right, perhaps when they were safely in Silver Falls. "You knew," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "You knew my father had connected Patterson to your family's deaths." "I found the letter last night," Jed confirmed, "after you fell asleep." Abby approached him, stopping just an arm's length away. "He believed your wife was investigating Patterson's land scheme. That's why they were killed." "Yes." The word came out rough-laden with 7 years of grief and unanswered questions. "You could have kept this from me," she observed. "Protected me from knowing how directly our tragedies are connected." Jed shook his head. "You deserve the truth. All of it." Something shifted in her expression, then a softening, a recognition. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm, the touch light but grounding. "Then we'll find justice together for all of them." The simple declaration spoken in the golden light of early morning felt like both a promise and a prayer. Jed covered her hand with his own for a brief moment, sealing their shared purpose without words. Thomas cleared his throat from the doorway, reluctant to interrupt, but aware of the pressing need to depart. "The horses are ready." The journey began in tense silence, each rider alert for signs of pursuit. As they navigated the winding trail that led from the sheltered valley, Thomas again took the lead, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as he guided them along paths that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. The day unfolded beneath a clear autumn sky, the sun climbing higher, but providing little warmth in the crisp mountain air. They avoided open ground whenever possible, keeping to forest cover and rocky passages where their tracks would be difficult to follow. At midday, they paused briefly to rest the horses beside a small alpine lake, its surface reflecting the surrounding peaks in perfect mirrored symmetry. "My father brought me here once," Abby said, breaking the long silence as she gazed across the still water. "We were gathering wildflowers for the church. He told me that places like this were God's cathedrals, more perfect than anything man could build." Jed watched as she knelt by the water's edge, dipping her fingers into its crystal clarity. The simple action seemed almost ceremonial, a communion with memory and loss. "He sounds like a wise man," Jed offered, sensing her need to speak of her father to keep his memory alive through shared stories. A small smile touched her lips. "He was, not just in scriptural matters, but in understanding people, their strengths and weaknesses, their capacity for both good and evil." She rose, wiping her wet fingers on her skirt. "He believed everyone deserved mercy, even those who had done terrible things." "Even Patterson?" Jed asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Abby met his gaze steadily. "Especially men like Patterson. Not because they deserve forgiveness, but because harboring hatred damages our own souls." She hesitated. "I struggle with that teaching now, after everything." Jed understood that struggle all too well. For 7 years, he had lived in a barren emotional landscape, neither forgiving nor forgetting, simply existing in the hollow aftermath of loss. The possibility of another way of healing rather than merely surviving seemed both foreign and faintly familiar, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. Thomas approached from where he'd been scouting ahead. "We should continue," he said. There's a ridge about 2 hours' ride from here that offers a clear view of Silver Falls. If we reach it by dusk, we can assess the town before approaching." They remounted and resumed their journey, the terrain gradually changing as they descended from the higher elevations. The dense pine forests gave way to more varied growth, aspen and oak, interspersed among the evergreens, their autumn colors adding warmth to the landscape. As predicted, they reached the ridge with the last light of day bleeding from the sky. Below them, nestled in a wide valley, lay Silver Falls, larger than Valley Creek, with buildings clustered around a central street and outlying farms scattered across the surrounding countryside. Lanterns were being lit throughout the town, creating a constellation of warm light against the gathering darkness. "The courthouse is there," Thomas said, pointing to a substantial stone building at the north end of the main street. "Judge Harrington should be holding court tomorrow according to the circuit schedule." Jed surveyed the town with a professional eye, noting entry points, potential watch points, and signs of law enforcement. "It seems quiet enough," he observed. "No unusual activity that would suggest Patterson's influence has reached here." "We can't be certain," Abby cautioned. "Patterson has connections throughout the territory. We should approach with care." They made camp a short distance from the ridge in a hollow, sheltered by large boulders that would hide the small fire Thomas carefully built. The night air grew increasingly cold, as darkness deepened, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above them. Huddled near the fire for warmth, they shared the last of their provisions while discussing their plan for the following day. Thomas would enter the town first, posing as a trader, to assess the situation and determine Judge Harrington's exact whereabouts. If all seemed safe, Jed and Abby would follow, making their way directly to the courthouse to request an immediate audience with the judge. "What if he refuses to see us?" Abby asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind. "Or worse, what if he's in Patterson's pocket as well?" "Your father trusted him," Jed reminded her. "And from what the ledger shows, Patterson's influence doesn't extend this far south. Harrington has no reason to protect him." "Unless he's been bought since my father's notes were written," Abby persisted. "Or threatened." Thomas spoke up from where he was tending the fire. "My father knows of Harrington by reputation, says he's known for his independence and integrity. If anyone in the territorial justice system will listen to you, it's him." This reassurance seemed to ease some of Abby's tension. She wrapped her coat more tightly around herself against the night's chill and stared into the dancing flames. "It feels strange to be so close," she admitted. "After everything that's happened, to think that tomorrow might bring an end to it." Jed understood her mixture of hope and apprehension. The prospect of justice after so long seemed almost unreal, a dream that might dissolve upon waking. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "Patterson's days of operating with impunity are over. The evidence we have is too comprehensive to ignore." Thomas volunteered for the first watch, leaving Jed and Abby beside the fire as he moved to a position overlooking their back trail. In the relative privacy that followed, Abby turned to Jed with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "What will you do afterward?" she asked softly. "If we succeed, I mean." The question caught Jed off guard. He had been so focused on the immediate goal of bringing Patterson to justice that he had given little thought to what might follow. For 7 years, his life had been defined by the absence of answers, by the restless search for something he couldn't name. Without that driving force, what remained? "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've been a bounty hunter so long I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." Abby studied his face in the flickering firelight. "You could return to Valley Creek," she suggested. "Reclaim your land once Patterson's fraud is exposed." The idea stirred complicated emotions in Jed's chest. Valley Creek held both his deepest sorrows and his most cherished memories. Could he build a new life there in the shadow of what he had lost? Perhaps, he said, non-committal. And you, what will you do? A shadow crossed her face. I haven't thought that far ahead either. The church will need a new pastor. I could help until one is appointed, continue my father's charitable work. She paused, then added more quietly, but it would be difficult, living among so many reminders. Their eyes met across the fire, a wordless understanding passing between them. Both had lost not just loved ones, but the futures they had envisioned, the lives they had been building. Whatever came next would be constructed from the ruins of those earlier dreams. We should rest, Jed said, finally breaking the moment of connection that had grown almost too intense to bear. Tomorrow will test us both. Abby nodded, her expression pensive as she settled into her bedroll near the fire. Jed remained sitting a while longer, watching as she drifted into sleep, her features softening in repose. Only when he was certain she was deeply asleep did he allow himself to study her face more openly, noting the strength in her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the dark lashes resting against skin still bearing the fading mark of Patterson's cruelty. Something was changing within him, a slow thawing of the frozen landscape of his heart. It both comforted and terrified him, this cautious reawakening to possibility. Not now, he told himself firmly. Not until Patterson was dealt with. Not until justice was served. With that resolution, he moved to relieve Thomas from watch duty, carrying his rifle and his unsettled thoughts into the quiet darkness beyond the fire's glow. Morning brought a heavy mist that shrouded the valley, obscuring Silver Falls from view and providing additional cover for their approach. Thomas departed first, riding down into the swirling whiteness, with a promise to return within 2 hours with news of the town's situation. Jed and Abby remained at the camp, using the time to carefully review the evidence once more, ensuring they could present it clearly and convincingly to Judge Harrington. The ledger was comprehensive, but the most damning evidence lay in specific documents that detailed Patterson's fraudulent activities and connected him directly to the deaths of those who had opposed him. "This will be enough," Abby said with quiet confidence, as she refolded a sworn statement from a witness to one of Patterson's land seizures. "Even if Patterson has influential friends, they won't be able to protect him from this." Jed nodded, though a lifetime of experience had taught him that justice was rarely as straightforward as it should be. The powerful had ways of evading consequences that ordinary people could not. Still, he kept these doubts to himself, unwilling to undermine Abby's hard-won hope. The mist was beginning to lift, burned away by the strengthening sun, when Thomas returned. His expression was grim as he dismounted, and Jed felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the instinctive recognition of approaching danger. "Patterson's men are in town," Thomas reported without preamble. "At least a dozen that I could see, watching the roads and the courthouse. They're being discreet, but they're definitely looking for someone." Abby's face paled. "How could they have known we'd come here?" "They might not know specifically," Jed reasoned. "Patterson could be covering all possible destinations where we might seek help." Thomas nodded in agreement. "I overheard 2 of them talking outside the general store. They mentioned checking every town with a circuit judge within 100 miles. "What about Judge Harrington?" Abby asked. "Is he holding court today?" "He is," Thomas confirmed. "I saw him arrive at the courthouse about an hour ago. He's hearing cases all day according to the posted schedule." Jed considered this information, weighing their dwindling options. "If Patterson's men are watching the courthouse, we can't simply walk in. We need another approach." They huddled together, speaking in low voices despite the isolation of their camp, as if Patterson's reach extended even to this remote ridge. Various plans were proposed and discarded, each presenting risks that seemed too great given the importance of their mission. Finally, Abby spoke up with quiet determination. "I should go alone." Both men turned to her in surprise. "Patterson's men are looking for a man matching Jed's description, and a woman," she explained. "They may not recognize me if I'm alone, especially if I'm dressed differently." "It's too dangerous," Jed objected immediately. "If they do recognize you, it's our best chance," Abby insisted. "I can approach the courthouse as a petitioner seeking the judge's help. Many women do so, widows with property disputes, mothers seeking support for their children. I'd attract less attention than either of you." Thomas was nodding slowly, seeing the logic in her plan. "She's right. A woman alone would draw less scrutiny." Jed felt an irrational surge of protectiveness, a need to shield her from further risk. But he recognized the practicality of her suggestion, and more importantly, her right to make this choice. This was her fight, as much as his, perhaps more so. "How would you get the evidence to Harrington?" he asked, his tone indicating provisional acceptance of her plan. "I'll request a private audience claiming a sensitive matter of law," Abby replied. "Once alone with him, I can explain everything and present the evidence." The simplicity of the plan was its strength, direct, relying more on ordinary behavior than elaborate deception. Still, Jed insisted on modifications to improve her safety. "Thomas and I will position ourselves near the courthouse, ready to intervene if anything goes wrong," he said. "And you'll need a different appearance, something that won't connect you to the woman who escaped from Valley Creek." Thomas offered to return to town to purchase suitable clothing for Abby and gather additional information about the courthouse layout and Patterson's men. While he was gone, Jed and Abby continued to refine their plan, identifying potential escape routes and establishing signals they could use to communicate from a distance. When Thomas returned with a bundle of clothing, Abby disappeared behind a stand of trees to change. She emerged transformed, dressed in a respectable dark blue dress with a matching bonnet that partially concealed her face. With her hair arranged differently and a shawl draped over her shoulders, she bore little resemblance to the battered, defiant woman Jed had first seen in chains. "Will it be enough?" she asked, turning slowly for their assessment. "It should be," Thomas confirmed. "You look like any other respectable woman with business at the courthouse." Jed studied her more carefully, noting that while the clothing concealed her identity effectively, it did nothing to diminish the quiet strength that radiated from her. "Keep your head lowered when passing Patterson's men," he advised. "And remember, at the first sign of recognition or danger, abandon the plan and return here immediately." Abby nodded, her expression resolute. "I understand the risks, Jed, but this may be our only chance to reach Judge Harrington before Patterson discovers our location." They departed the camp as the afternoon sun broke fully through the dissipating mist, following separate paths down to Silver Falls. Thomas would enter first, taking a position near the general store that offered a clear view of the courthouse entrance. Jed would follow, finding concealment in an alleyway across from the courthouse where he could observe without being easily spotted. Abby would enter town last, approaching the courthouse directly as any ordinary petitioner might. The plan unfolded with initial success. From his vantage point in the alley between a hardware store and a dressmaker's shop, Jed watched as Abby walked purposefully up the courthouse steps. Her posture was perfect, neither hurried nor hesitant, a woman with legitimate business and nothing to hide. He held his breath as she passed two men loitering near the entrance, men whose watchful postures marked them clearly as Patterson's hired guns, despite their attempts to appear casual. Neither gave her more than a passing glance. Once she had disappeared into the courthouse, Jed allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Now everything depended on whether Judge Harrington would grant her an audience and whether he was indeed the man of integrity Reverend Hayes had believed him to be. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour crawled toward 2. Jed maintained his position, ignoring the growing discomfort of standing motionless for so long. Across the street, he occasionally caught glimpses of Thomas, who had positioned himself on the porch of the general store, apparently engaged in casual conversation with locals while maintaining his own vigil. When Abby finally emerged from the courthouse, Jed's trained eye immediately noted the tension in her bearing, despite her attempts to maintain a composed facade. Something had gone wrong. She descended the steps with measured strides, avoiding eye contact with the men still loitering nearby. As she passed the alley where Jed was concealed, she made a subtle gesture with her hand, the signal they had agreed upon to indicate trouble. Jed remained in position, watching as she continued down the street toward the prearranged meeting point at the edge of town. Only when she was well away from the courthouse did he slip out of the alley, taking an indirect route to follow her while scanning constantly for signs of pursuit. They reunited at an abandoned barn they had identified during their planning. A structure just far enough from town to offer privacy, but not so remote as to attract attention. Thomas arrived shortly after, having taken yet another route to avoid being connected to either of them. "What happened?" Jed asked as soon as they were safely inside the weathered building. Abby removed her bonnet with a frustrated gesture. "Judge Harrington is gone. Left yesterday for Denver on urgent business, according to his clerk." "Gone?" Jed echoed the single word, laden with disappointment. "Did the clerk say when he'll return?" "Not for at least a week," Abby replied, pacing the dusty floor of the barn. "And it gets worse. The clerk was suspicious of my questions. When I tried to explain that I had evidence of serious crimes that only the judge should see, he insisted that any such materials should be submitted formally through his office." Thomas leaned against a rotting support beam, his expression grave. "Did you leave your name?" "No," Abby assured him. "I claim to be a widow with sensitive information regarding land disputes." But he was clearly uncomfortable with my insistence on speaking directly to the judge. Jed processed this setback, his mind already reaching for alternative plans. "Did you see any sign that Patterson's men were suspicious of you?" "I don't think so," Abby said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "But as I was leaving, more of them were arriving. Their numbers in town are growing." This news deepened Jed's concern. Patterson was committing significant resources to finding them, an indication of just how desperate he was to recover or destroy the evidence they carried. "We can't wait a week for Harrington to return," Jed decided. "Patterson will have the entire territory searched by then. We need another solution." "What about following Harrington to Denver?" Thomas suggested. "If he left yesterday, he can't be more than a day's ride ahead of us." Jed considered this option. Denver represented both opportunity and danger. The territorial capital would have officials with the authority to act on their evidence, but it would also be easier for Patterson to deploy men there to intercept them. "The journey to Denver would take us across open country," he said, thinking aloud. "We'd be exposed, vulnerable to ambush. But once there, we'd have access to territorial officials beyond Patterson's immediate influence," Abby countered. "It might be our best chance." The discussion was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching at speed. Thomas moved quickly to a gap in the barn wall, peering out toward the road. "Riders," he reported grimly. "At least 6 coming from town, moving with purpose." Jed joined him at the makeshift window, assessing the approaching threat. The riders were indeed moving with the coordinated precision of men on a mission rather than casual travelers. Whether they were specifically tracking Abby or simply expanding their search pattern was impossible to determine, but the risk was too great to ignore. "We need to move," Jed said, already gathering their minimal belongings. "Now." They slipped out through the barn's rear door, keeping the structure between themselves and the approaching riders as they made their way to where their horses were concealed in a small grove of trees. Mounting quickly, they set off away from both the barn and Silver Falls, riding hard for the cover of a nearby forest. The sound of pursuit came sooner than expected shouts and the thunder of hooves gaining ground behind them. They had been spotted. "They're gaining," Thomas called as they pushed their already tired mounts to greater speed. "We won't outrun them on this terrain." Jed made a rapid assessment of their surroundings, looking for any tactical advantage the landscape might offer. Ahead, the forest thickened, the trees growing closer together with dense undergrowth between them. It would slow their progress, but might provide the cover they needed. "Into the trees," he directed, guiding his horse toward the densest part of the woodland. "Single file, Thomas in front. He knows these forests better than either of us." Thomas took the lead without hesitation, navigating a path through the increasingly tight spaces between trees. Branches whipped at their faces and shoulders as they rode the horses, snorting with the effort of maintaining speed on the uneven ground. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as the forest's density proved challenging for their hunters. But just as Jed began to hope they might have gained a meaningful advantage, a sharp crack split the air, the unmistakable report of a rifle. "Rifle fire," he warned unnecessarily, as Abby and Thomas had clearly recognized the sound as well. "They're trying to slow us down." Another shot followed, this one closer, splintering bark from a tree just ahead of Thomas's horse. The animal shied violently, nearly unseating its rider before Thomas regained control. "This way," Thomas called, veering sharply left onto a barely visible game trail. "There's a ravine ahead that leads to higher ground. They'll have trouble following with horses." They pushed on the trail, narrowing further, until finally they were forced to dismount and lead their horses through the tight passages between boulders and trees. The physical exertion coming after days of hard riding and minimal rest took its toll. Jed could see the fatigue in Abby's face, though she pressed forward without complaint, one hand leading her horse and the other clutching the precious saddlebag containing the evidence. The ravine Thomas had mentioned appeared suddenly before them, a steep-sided gully, carved by spring runoff its bottom, now dry but strewn with rocks and fallen trees. They descended carefully, the horses picking their way with instinctive caution down the treacherous slope. "We'll follow this upward," Thomas explained, pointing to where the ravine curved toward higher ground. "It narrows further ahead, becomes almost impassable for horses. They'll have to dismount and follow on foot, which will slow them considerably." The strategy was sound, but Jed's experience warned him that determined pursuers would not be easily discouraged. Patterson's men had tracked them across miles of wilderness already. A difficult ravine might delay, but would not stop them. His concerns proved prescient when another rifle shot echoed through the ravine, the bullet ricocheting off rock uncomfortably close to where they stood. Glancing back, Jed caught sight of movement on the ridge above. A rifleman had found a vantage point that allowed him to fire down into the ravine. "Take cover!" he shouted, pushing Abby toward an overhanging rock formation that would provide some protection from the shooter above. Thomas joined them, pulling the nervous horses into what shelter the formation offered. "They've split up," Thomas observed grimly. Some following the ravine, others taking positions on the high ground. It was a standard tactic for experienced trackers, one Jed himself had employed when pursuing particularly elusive bounties. The realization that they faced not just hired guns, but skilled hunters increased the gravity of their situation. "We can't stay here," Abby said, her voice steady despite the danger. "And we can't go back." "Forward, then," Jed decided. "But we'll need to create a diversion." He quickly outlined a plan. Thomas would take Abby and the evidence continuing up the ravine to where it narrowed, while Jed would create a distraction to draw off their pursuers. Once clear of immediate danger, they would rendezvous at a landmark visible from their current position, a distinctive double-peaked mountain to the northeast. "I don't like splitting up," Abby objected, her eyes reflecting both fear for his safety and determination to remain together. "It's our best chance," Jed insisted. "The evidence is what matters most. It has to reach Denver with or without me." Thomas nodded in reluctant agreement. "He's right. Together, we're an easier target. Separated, at least some of us have a better chance of getting through." Abby looked between them, clearly torn between practical necessity and emotional resistance to the plan. Finally, she reached into the saddlebag and removed a small portion of the evidence key documents that directly implicated Patterson in the murders. "Take these," she said, pressing them into Jed's hand, "in case we're separated longer than expected. This way, even if only one of us reaches Denver, Patterson will still face justice." The gesture was both practical and deeply symbolic, a sharing of the burden they had carried together, a recognition that their cause was larger than any one of them. Jed accepted the documents, tucking them securely inside his coat. "The double peak," he confirmed, meeting her eyes with an intensity that conveyed more than words could express. "I'll find you there." With a final nod to Thomas, who would now be responsible for Abby's safety, Jed prepared to create the diversion they needed. He selected several cartridges from his ammunition belt, placing them carefully among dry leaves and small twigs gathered from the ravine floor. With flint and steel, he struck sparks until the tinder caught, then moved quickly away from the makeshift explosive. "Go now," he urged Thomas and Abby. "Don't wait for me, no matter what you hear." Thomas led Abby and the horses deeper into the ravine, disappearing around a bend in the rocky corridor, just as the heat ignited the first cartridge. The explosion was small but sharp, echoing through the ravine like a gunshot. Jed added fuel to the fire, ensuring it would spread to the remaining cartridges, then moved in the opposite direction from Thomas and Abby, making his exit from the ravine as visibly as possible. As he'd hoped, the explosions and his deliberate exposure drew the attention of their pursuers. Shouts echoed from above, and the movement of men redirecting their efforts toward him rather than continuing along the ravine confirmed the success of his diversion. Jed made his way up the steep slope on the opposite side of the ravine, intentionally leaving clear tracks for the hunters to follow. Only when he reached the ridge did he allow himself a backward glance, satisfied to see several mounted men converging on his position rather than continuing after Thomas and Abby. Now the chase began in earnest, Jed on foot, against mounted pursuers in terrain he didn't know well. His only advantages were his experience in wilderness survival and the fact that his hunters would need to split their attention between tracking him and watching for an ambush. He set a punishing pace, moving through the forest with the economy of motion that had served him well in his years as a bounty hunter. When opportunities presented themselves, he laid false trails or created minor obstacles to slow his pursuers. A strategically felled small tree across a narrow passage, a scattered spray of stones down a slope, to suggest a direction he hadn't taken, small deceptions that might buy precious minutes. The afternoon wore on, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Jed maintained his northeastern heading, working his way gradually toward the double-peaked mountain that served as his rendezvous point with Thomas and Abby. The sounds of pursuit had grown more distant, suggesting his tactics had been at least partially successful in confusing or delaying the hunters. As dusk approached, he found himself at the edge of a small clearing where a spring bubbled up from between rocks to form a shallow pool. Thirst drove him to stop briefly, drinking deeply of the cold, clear water, while scanning his surroundings for signs of danger. The attack came without warning, a rushing movement from the trees to his left, followed by the impact of a body driving him to the ground. Jed rolled with the force of the collision, coming up to face his attacker with his knife already drawn from his belt. The man before him was lean and weathered, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to violence. Not one of Patterson's usual hired guns, but something more dangerous. A professional tracker, perhaps, or a bounty hunter like himself. Calloway, the man acknowledged, his own blade glinting in the fading light. Judge Patterson wants you alive, but he didn't specify undamaged. Jed didn't waste breath on a response, instead circling cautiously, assessing his opponent's stance and movement. The man was experienced, holding his knife with the confidence of frequent use, his balance perfect, as he mirrored Jed's careful positioning. The first exchange came fast, a testing of defense's blades flashing, but neither man fully committing. They separated again, each having learned something of the other's style and speed. "Where's the girl and the evidence?" the tracker demanded, never taking his eyes from Jed's blade. "Tell me, and this ends easier for you." "Gone," Jed replied simply. "Far beyond your reach by now." Anger flashed across the tracker's face, and he attacked again, this time with greater commitment. Jed parried the thrust, feeling the bite of steel across his forearm as he countered with his own strike. His blade found flesh as well, opening a shallow cut along his opponent's ribs. They separated once more, both bleeding, but neither significantly impaired. In the distance, Jed could hear voices and the movement of horses, the rest of his pursuers converging on their location. "Your friends are coming," the tracker observed with a cold smile. "Last chance to make this easy on yourself." Jed's response was another attack, this one calculated to appear desperate, but actually precisely controlled. He feinted high, then struck low, his blade slicing across the tracker's thigh. The man grunted in pain, but managed to land a blow of his own, his knife cutting through Jed's shirt to score a line of fire across his shoulder. Blood made their grips slippery, the fight becoming increasingly dangerous for both as fatigue and injury took their toll. Jed knew he needed to end this quickly before the approaching riders arrived to tip the balance decisively against him. His opportunity came when the tracker lunged forward, overextending slightly in his eagerness to finish the fight. Jed sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, and used his own momentum to drive him forward and down. They fell together, Jed's greater weight pinning the tracker as they hit the ground hard. The struggle that followed was brutal and intimate, both men straining for advantage with their faces inches apart, breath mingling as they fought for control of the tracker's knife. Jed felt his strength beginning to ebb, the blood loss and days of hard travel extracting their price. In a final desperate surge, he wrenched the tracker's arm at an unnatural angle. The man cried out, his grip on the knife faltering just enough for Jed to twist the weapon free and drive it down. The tracker's eyes widened in shock, then gradually dulled as his life ebbed away. Jed rolled off him, retrieving his own knife and rising unsteadily to his feet. The voices of the approaching riders were closer now, leaving him little time to collect himself. Moving with determined purpose despite his injuries, Jed quickly searched the tracker's body, finding ammunition, a small amount of food, and most valuable, a map of the region marked with what appeared to be search patterns and locations of Patterson's men. Taking these items, Jed disappeared into the deepening shadows of the forest just as the first riders entered the clearing. Their shouts of anger at finding their comrade dead instead of Jed in custody followed him into the darkness, spurring him to push beyond the limits of his depleted strength. Night fell completely as he continued northeast, guided now by stars rather than landmarks. The double-peaked mountain was lost in darkness, but Jed maintained his course by keeping the North Star at a specific angle to his path, a navigation technique honed through years in the wilderness. His wounds throbbed with each step, the blood from his shoulder and arm having soaked through his shirt and begun to dry in stiff patches. Thirst returned stronger than before, and hunger gnawed at his empty stomach. But more pressing than these physical discomforts was his concern for Abby and Thomas. Had they escaped their pursuers? Had they reached the rendezvous point, or been forced to continue on without him? The night seemed endless, a dark journey marked by pain and worry. When Jed finally stopped to rest, it was not by choice but by necessity. His body simply refused to continue without some respite. He found shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation, concealing himself as best he could before allowing exhaustion to claim him. His sleep was shallow and troubled, filled with fragments of dreams Elizabeth and Sarah calling to him from a burning house he couldn't reach, Abby in chains, her eyes accusing as Patterson passed sentence, the tracker's face as life left his body, another death added to the tally Jed carried in his soul. He woke with the first light of dawn, stiff and aching, but alive. His wounds had stopped bleeding, though movement reopened the deeper cut on his shoulder, sending fresh pain radiating down his arm. Using strips torn from his shirt, he bound the injuries as best he could, then forced himself to eat a small portion of the food taken from the tracker, washing it down with water from his nearly empty canteen. The map proved invaluable, showing not only the search patterns Patterson's men were following, but also trails and water sources in the region. According to the markings, the double-peaked mountain, his rendezvous point with Abby and Thomas, lay about 5 miles northeast of his current position. With renewed determination, Jed set out, moving more cautiously now that daylight made him more visible to potential pursuers. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as he approached the mountain, forcing him to navigate rocky slopes and dense undergrowth that sapped his already diminished strength. By midday, he had reached the base of the Twin Peaks. The rendezvous point Thomas had identified was a small plateau halfway up the southern slope overlooking the valley they had traversed. Jed began the ascent, each step an exercise in will over pain and exhaustion. The plateau, when he finally reached it, was empty, no sign of Thomas, Abby, or their horses. A cold knot of fear formed in Jed's stomach as he surveyed the area, looking for any indication that they had been there and left, or worse, been intercepted before reaching the meeting place. A careful examination of the ground revealed no recent tracks, suggesting they had not yet arrived. Jed found a position that offered both concealment and a clear view of the approaches to the plateau, then settled in to wait, ignoring the protests of his injured body. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. The sun crossed its zenith and began its descent toward the western horizon. Jed's worry deepened with each passing hour, but he maintained his vigil, unwilling to abandon the rendezvous while any chance remained that Abby and Thomas might still arrive. As the afternoon waned, movement on the eastern approach caught his attention, 2 riders moving slowly but purposefully up the slope. Relief surged through him as he recognized Thomas's distinctive posture and Abby's smaller figure behind him. Jed stood, moving into the open where they would see him. Abby spotted him first, her face lighting with unmistakable joy, even at a distance. They urged their tired horses forward, closing the final distance to the plateau in minutes rather than the hour it might have taken at their previous pace. "We thought we'd lost you," Abby said as she dismounted, her voice breaking slightly on the words. She moved toward him with evident concern, noting his blood-stained clothing and the makeshift bandages on his arm and shoulder. "You're hurt." "It looks worse than it is," Jed assured her, though the lie was transparent to all of them. "What matters is that you're both safe and the evidence is secure." Thomas dismounted more slowly, his own exhaustion evident in the stiffness of his movements. "We were followed for miles," he reported. "Only lost them late last night when we crossed a river and doubled back along its bank." "Patterson's men are everywhere," Abby added, reaching for her saddlebag. The evidence is safe, but we're effectively surrounded. Every trail and road seems to be watched. Jed produced the map he had taken from the tracker, spreading it on a flat rock where they could all examine it. This shows their search patterns, he explained, and it confirms what you've seen. They're concentrating their efforts on all routes leading to Denver. Thomas studied the map with the practiced eye of someone intimately familiar with the terrain it depicted. "There's a gap here," he said, finally pointing to an area southeast of their current position. "A difficult passage through the mountains that they don't seem to be covering." "Because it's nearly impassable this time of year," Abby observed. "The first snows have likely already fallen at those elevations." "And nearly impassable isn't the same as completely impassable," Jed noted, considering the possibility. "If we could make it through while they're focused on the more obvious routes." "It would be dangerous," Thomas warned. "The trail is narrow, exposed to weather, and prone to rock slides. And if snow has fallen, we might lose the path entirely." Abby looked between the two men, weighing the risks against their dwindling options. "What alternatives do we have?" "Every day that passes gives Patterson more time to extend his search and influence." The decision, when it came, was unanimous despite the dangers. They would rest until nightfall, then begin the journey toward the mountain passage, traveling under cover of darkness to minimize the risk of detection. As Thomas tended to the horses, Abby insisted on examining Jed's wounds properly. Her touch was gentle but confident, as she cleaned the cuts with water from her canteen and applied a salve she produced from a small tin in her pocket. "My father taught me basic medicine," she explained as she worked. "He believed healing bodies and souls often went hand in hand in his ministry." Jed watched her face as she concentrated on her task, noting the fatigue etched in the fine lines around her eyes and the determined set of her mouth. Despite everything she had endured, the loss of her father, imprisonment, days of hard riding, and constant danger, her spirit remained unbroken. "Thank you," he said simply when she had finished rebandaging his injuries. She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them in that moment of quiet connection. "We take care of each other," she replied softly. "That's how we'll survive this." The simple truth of her words settled in Jed's heart, a warmth that pushed back against the cold pragmatism that had governed his life for so long. For 7 years he had deliberately avoided connections, viewing them as vulnerabilities rather than strengths. Now, facing the most dangerous challenge of his life, he found himself drawing courage and purpose from the bond forged with this remarkable woman and their ally. They rested through the remaining daylight hours, taking turns standing watch while the others slept. As darkness fell, they prepared to depart, packing their meager supplies and ensuring the evidence was securely stowed. The journey to the mountain passage would take at least 2 days of hard riding, according to Thomas's estimation. 2 days during which Patterson's net might draw tighter around them, 2 days of exposure to both human hunters and the unforgiving elements of the high country. As they mounted their horses and began their descent from the plateau, Jed found himself oddly at peace, despite the dangers ahead. For the first time since losing his family, he was fighting for something beyond mere survival or professional duty. In Abby's quiet strength and Thomas's steadfast loyalty, he had found companions worthy of such a fight, and perhaps if they survived the beginnings of a new kind of family. The moon rose over the twin peaks, illuminating their path. As they rode into the gathering darkness, 3 figures bound together by a shared purpose and the hope that justice so long denied might finally be within reach. The mountain passage lived up to Thomas's warning, a narrow, treacherous trail that wound between towering rock faces and along precipitous ledges where a single misstep could mean disaster. Snow had indeed fallen at the higher elevations, making the already difficult path even more dangerous. They had been traveling for a day and a half, pushing themselves and their horses to the limits of endurance. The cold was relentless, a biting presence that seeped through clothing and seemed to settle in their very bones. Food was rationed carefully, each meal a brief respite from hunger rather than true satisfaction. Despite these hardships, they had made steady progress. According to Thomas, they would reach the other side of the passage by nightfall if they maintained their current pace. Beyond lay more hospitable terrain and eventually the road to Denver. The day had started clear, the sky a brilliant blue above the snow-dusted peaks. But as afternoon approached, clouds began to gather dark and heavy, with the promise of more snow. The temperature dropped further, and the wind picked up driving, stinging particles of ice against any exposed skin. "We need to find shelter before this storm hits," Thomas called back to Jed and Abby as they navigated a particularly narrow section of trail. "There's a hunter's cabin another mile ahead if it still stands." They pressed on the trail, becoming increasingly difficult to follow as the weather deteriorated. The horses struggled their hooves, slipping on ice-covered stone, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a crude shelter, 3 walls, and a slanting roof open on one side to serve as a windbreak rather than true accommodation. But it offered protection from the worst of the elements, and the small stand of pines surrounding it provided some wood for a fire. As Thomas and Jed gathered what dry branches they could find, Abby cleared snow from the cabin's interior and laid out their bedrolls. By the time the storm descended in earnest, they had a small fire burning, and the horses tethered in the lee of the structure as protected as possible from the howling wind. Huddled near the fire, they shared the last of their provisions, jerky, hardtack, and coffee brewed from melted snow. The simple meal felt like a feast after the day's exertions, warming them from within as the fire provided external heat. "How much farther to Denver once we clear the passage?" Abby asked, her hands cradling the tin cup of coffee for warmth. 3 days' ride under normal conditions," Thomas replied. "But with the weather and our need to avoid main roads, it could take longer." Beatrice stared into the flames, considering their situation. The tracker's map had shown a concentration of Patterson's men along all major routes to Denver, but it was impossible to know how extensive his reach might be by now. The judge's resources and determination had proven greater than any of them had anticipated. "We should separate again once we're through the passage," he suggested, the decision forming as he spoke. "Thomas, you and Abby continue to Denver with the bulk of the evidence. I'll take a different route, creating a diversion if needed." Abby's response was immediate and firm. "No, we've discussed this before. We stay together." "It's the most practical approach," Jed insisted. "If Patterson's men are waiting at the end of the passage, 3 riders together make an obvious target. And 1 injured man alone has little chance against multiple pursuers," Abby countered, her eyes reflecting both the firelight and her determination. "We've come this far by supporting each other. Dividing now only weakens us." Thomas, who had been listening silently to the exchange, finally spoke. "There may be another option. My father has connections among the Ute bands in this region. If we can reach their winter camp, they might provide escort to Denver guides who know paths even Patterson's men wouldn't think to watch." This suggestion offered a compromise that addressed both Jed's concern about their vulnerability as a group and Abby's insistence on remaining together. After some discussion, they agreed to seek out the Ute camp once they had cleared the mountain passage. With the decision made, they settled in for the night, taking turns keeping watch and tending the fire as the storm raged outside their shelter. Jed took the first watch, sitting near the open side of the cabin where he could observe both their surroundings and his sleeping companions. Abby slept fitfully, her face troubled even in repose. Once she cried out softly, some nightmare disturbing her rest. Without thinking, Jed moved to her side, gently touching her shoulder. She woke with a start, eyes wide and confused, until recognition dawned. "You were dreaming," he explained softly. Not pleasantly from the sound of it. She sat up, drawing her blanket more tightly around her shoulders. "I was back in the jail cell," she admitted, hearing the sentence read again, hanging for a murder I didn't commit. But this time, no one came to help. The vulnerability in her voice stirred something protective in Jed's chest. "That future is gone," he assured her. "You rewrote it when you survived, when you fought back." Abby studied his face in the flickering firelight, her eyes searching for something reassurance, perhaps, or shared understanding. "Sometimes I wonder what kind of future remains after all this. If justice is served, if Patterson pays for his crimes, what then? What life is waiting for me beyond this pursuit?" It was a question Jed had been asking himself as well, one that had no simple answer. For too long, both their lives had been defined by loss and the quest for retribution. What would fill that space if they succeeded? "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I believe there is a future worth finding." She smiled, then a small but genuine expression that transformed her face despite the exhaustion and worry that marked it. "My father would say that faith is trusting in what we cannot yet see." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Jed said, echoing his earlier sentiment. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Abby replied softly. "Despite your profession, he had a gift for seeing past surfaces to what lay beneath." She hesitated, then added, "Like his daughter." The implication that she saw something in him worth knowing, worth valuing, touched Jed more deeply than he expected. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the storm beyond their shelter, somehow making the small space between them feel more intimate, more separate from the dangers that had pursued them for so long. "You should rest," Abby said finally. "I'll take the watch now." Jed wanted to object, to insist she needed sleep more than he did, but the determined set of her jaw told him such arguments would be futile. With a nod of acceptance, he moved to his own bedroll, settling into it with a weariness that seemed to reach his very bones. As he drifted toward sleep, he was conscious of Abby's presence nearby, a steady, comforting awareness that followed him into dreams far more peaceful than he had known in years. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow blanketed the narrow trail and surrounding peaks, pristine and blinding in the morning sunlight. The beauty was deceptive. Beneath the white mantle lay ice and hidden obstacles that would make their continued journey even more treacherous. They set out after a meager breakfast, Thomas again taking the lead to navigate the increasingly difficult path. The horses moved cautiously, seeming to understand the danger of each step on the snow-covered stone. Progress was painfully slow, each mile a testament to their determination rather than their speed. By midday, however, Thomas reported that they were nearing the end of the passage. The trail had begun to descend, and the terrain ahead appeared to open into a broader valley. Their hope was short-lived. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Thomas suddenly reined in his horse, raising a hand in warning. Jed and Abby halted behind him, instantly alert to potential danger. "Riders," Thomas whispered, pointing to the valley below where the mountain passage ended. "At least 6 positioned to watch the trail." Jed dismounted carefully, moving forward on foot to observe the situation without being seen. Sure enough, a group of mounted men were stationed at the valley entrance, their positions selected to provide clear views of anyone emerging from the passage. "Patterson's men?" Abby asked quietly when Jed returned to report. "Most likely," he confirmed grimly. "They've anticipated our route better than we hoped." The realization was a heavy blow. After days of difficult travel, enduring cold hunger, and the constant threat of discovery, they had arrived at what should have been their path to freedom, only to find it blocked. "Is there another way down?" Jed asked Thomas, who knew the region best. Thomas shook his head. "Not from here. We'd have to backtrack almost to the beginning of the passage to find another route, and even then, it would lead us away from Denver." They retreated a short distance up the trail to discuss their options, each acutely aware that time was working against them. Their supplies were nearly exhausted, their horses tired, and Jed's wounds, while not life-threatening, continued to sap his strength. "We could wait until dark," Abby suggested. "Try to slip past them under cover of night." "They'll be expecting that," Jed pointed out. "And they have the advantage of position and numbers." Thomas had been silent, his expression thoughtful as he considered alternatives. "There may be a way," he said finally. "Not around them, but through them." He outlined a bold plan. Using their knowledge of the Watchers' positions, they would split up at the final approach. Thomas would create a diversion on one side of the valley, drawing attention, and hopefully some of the men away from their posts. Meanwhile, Jed and Abby would make a direct dash through the weakened center of their line, relying on surprise and speed to break through before the remaining men could effectively respond. "It's risky," Jed acknowledged, "but it might be our best chance." Abby looked troubled. "What about you, Thomas? How will you escape once you've created the diversion?" "I know these mountains," Thomas replied with quiet confidence. "Once I've drawn them off, I can lose them in terrain. They won't dare follow me through. We'll meet at my father's trading post in 3 days." The plan settled, they waited for dusk, using the intervening hours to rest the horses and prepare themselves for what would likely be a desperate run. Jed checked and rechecked his weapons, while Abby ensured the evidence was secured where it would not be lost, even if they were separated in the chaos. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, they moved into position near the end of the passage. Thomas clasped hands with each of them, in turn his grip firm and reassuring. 3 days, he reminded them. "My father will help you reach Denver if I haven't returned by then." With a final nod, he moved away, leading his horse along a narrow side trail that would position him for his diversionary attack. Jed and Abby waited in tense silence, watching the gathering darkness and listening for the signal that would launch their desperate gambit. It came as a series of rifle shots from the eastern edge of the valley, followed by shouts of alarm from the watchers below. Thomas had begun his diversion, and judging by the reaction, it was having the desired effect. Several riders broke from their positions, moving toward the source of the disturbance. "Now!" Jed said urgently, mounting his horse and ensuring Abby was securely in her saddle. "Stay close to me and don't stop for anything." They emerged from the passage at a full gallop, their horses' hooves throwing up plumes of snow as they charged directly toward the gap in the Watchers' line. For a crucial moment, surprise worked in their favor. The remaining men were focused on the commotion Thomas had created, their attention directed away from the trail. By the time the alarm was raised and the Watchers realized their quarry was breaking through the center, Jed and Abby had covered half the distance to freedom. Shots rang out, bullets whining past them as they rode, but the hasty fire was inaccurate, made more so by the fading light and the speed of their charge. They were nearly through when disaster struck. Abby's horse, perhaps hit by a stray bullet, or simply misstepping in the snow, stumbled violently. She clung to the saddle, fighting to keep her seat as the animal recovered its footing, but the momentary slowing was enough for one of the pursuers to close the distance. Jed wheeled his mount around, drawing his revolver as he saw the rider bearing down on Abby. He fired twice, forcing the man to veer away, buying precious seconds for Abby to urge her horse forward again. Together, they broke through the line, riding hard for the cover of a wooded area at the far end of the valley. Behind them, the Watchers were mounting a disorganized pursuit, their original formation disrupted by Thomas's diversion and Jed and Abby's unexpected charge. The trees enveloped them like protective arms, the dense growth slowing their pace but also shielding them from further gunfire. They pressed on, navigating by starlight and the occasional glimpse of the moon through breaks in the forest canopy. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and the valley did they slow, allowing the exhausted horses to recover their breath. Jed listened intently for sounds of pursuit, but heard only the night sounds of the forest, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through pine branches. "Do you think we lost them?" Abby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Jed replied cautiously. "But they'll pick up our trail in the morning. We need to keep moving, find a place to rest that's defensible if they catch up to us." They continued through the night, following game trails, when possible creating as little sign of their passage as their haste allowed. The forest eventually gave way to more open country, rolling hills, covered in sagebrush and scattered stands of aspen, their bare branches silvered by moonlight. By dawn, they had reached a small stream, its waters partially frozen, but still flowing beneath a thin crust of ice. They stopped to water the horses and refill their canteens, both aware that they had pushed the animals almost beyond endurance. "How far to the trading post?" Abby asked, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes still alert and determined. Jed consulted the tracker's map, orientating himself based on landmarks visible in the early morning light. "About 30 miles southwest," he estimated, "a full day's ride under better circumstances. And Denver, almost 100 miles beyond that. But once we reach the trading post, we'll have help, fresh horses, supplies, perhaps guides, as Thomas suggested." They allowed themselves a brief rest, sharing the last of their food, a few strips of jerky and a handful of parched corn. As they prepared to continue their journey, Abby suddenly tensed, her gaze fixed on the ridge they had descended an hour earlier. "Riders," she said, pointing to where dark figures had appeared against the skyline. "They've found our trail." Jed cursed under his breath, counting at least 4 mounted men silhouetted against the morning sky. Their pursuers had been more determined or more skilled than he had hoped. "We need to move," he urged, helping Abby into her saddle despite the protest of his injured shoulder. "There's a canyon ahead that might offer some protection." They rode hard, pushing their already exhausted horses toward the distant line of cliffs that marked the canyon's edge. Behind them, their pursuers descended the ridge, moving faster on fresher mounts. The gap between hunters and hunted narrowed inexorably. What had begun as a distant threat became an immediate danger, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats growing louder with each passing minute. The canyon appeared before them, a jagged tear in the earth that dropped away suddenly from the rolling plain. A narrow trail switchbacked down its red stone walls to the bottom, where a small river flowed between stands of cottonwood trees. "Down there," Jed directed, guiding his horse toward the trail. "If we can reach the bottom before they're on us, the trees will provide cover." They had just started the descent when the first shots came, bullets striking stone near the trailhead. Jed urged Abby ahead of him, using his own body and horse as a shield between her and the gunfire. The trail was treacherous, narrow, with a sheer drop on one side and the canyon wall on the other. The horses picked their way down carefully, despite the urgency of their riders instinctively aware of the danger a misstep would bring. Halfway down, disaster struck again. A bullet found its mark in Jed's horse, the animal crying out in pain before collapsing beneath him. Jed managed to kick free of the stirrups as the horse fell, landing hard on the trail, but avoiding being crushed beneath the dying animal. "Jed!" Abby cried, reining in her mount and starting to turn back. "Keep going!" he shouted, drawing his rifle from the saddle scabbard before the fallen horse could roll off the trail and take his weapons with it. Get to the bottom. Torn between obedience and the instinct to help, Abby hesitated only a moment before continuing down the trail, understanding that both their lives and the evidence depended on at least one of them reaching safety. Jed took up a position behind his fallen horse, using the animal's body as cover as he sighted his rifle at the top of the trail where their pursuers would soon appear. The first rider came into view moments later, and Jed fired the shot, echoing off the canyon walls. The man fell from his saddle, rolling down the slope above the trail. The other pursuers pulled back momentarily, discouraged by the accurate fire from below. Jed used the respite to check on Abby's progress, relieved to see she had nearly reached the canyon floor. His position was untenable, however. The fallen horse provided limited cover, and once their pursuers regrouped, they could easily pin him down with rifle fire from above while working their way around to approach from multiple angles. Taking a deep breath, Jed made a decision. Retrieving the saddlebags containing his ammunition and the portion of evidence Abby had entrusted to him, he abandoned his position, making a controlled descent down the steep slope beside the trail. It was a dangerous move, sliding more than climbing, using brush and outcroppings to slow his fall, but it offered the only chance of reaching the canyon floor before being overwhelmed. By the time he reached the bottom, his hands were raw and bleeding his injured shoulder, screaming in protest. But he was alive and free. Abby was waiting among the cottonwoods, her face alight with relief at his appearance. "You made it," she breathed, dismounting to help him as he staggered the final few steps to her position. "For now," he replied grimly, glancing back up at the trail where their pursuers were beginning their own descent more cautiously after the loss of their companion. "We need to keep moving. They'll be on us again soon." Abby gestured to her horse. "Can we both ride?" Jed assessed the animal, noting its heaving flanks and trembling legs. "Not far, but maybe far enough to find a more defensible position." They mounted together, Jed behind Abby, the horse protesting the double burden, but responding gamely to Abby's gentle urging. They followed the river downstream, staying beneath the cover of the cottonwoods as long as possible. The canyon widened as they progressed, its walls becoming less steep, offering potential escape routes, but also making it harder to predict from which direction pursuit might come. The horse was flagging noticeably, its pace slowing despite their encouragement. "There," Jed said suddenly, pointing to a cluster of large boulders near the canyon wall. "That position gives us cover on 3 sides and a clear field of fire." They dismounted, Jed patting the exhausted horse gratefully before removing the saddlebags containing the evidence. "You've done your part," he told the animal, removing its bridle. "Find your own way now." As the horse wandered toward the river to drink, Jed and Abby took position among the boulders, arranging their weapons and the limited ammunition that remained. Neither spoke of what they both knew, that this might be their last stand, that the odds against them surviving another confrontation were growing longer with each passing hour. Instead, they prepared methodically, positioning themselves back to back, to watch different approaches, conserving their strength for the fight that was surely coming. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying in the sheltered canyon, making the wait for their pursuers a test of endurance as well as nerve. "Jed," Abby said quietly during a lull in their preparations, "if they take us, if it seems certain we won't escape, I want you to destroy the evidence." He turned to her in surprise. "The evidence is everything. It's what this has all been about." She met his gaze steadily. "Not everything. Not anymore. I won't let Patterson use it to harm anyone else. If he recovers these documents, he'll know every witness, every person who helped my father gather information. They'll all be in danger." The logic of her request was undeniable, Yet it represented a surrender of sorts, an acknowledgement that their quest for justice might end in failure. Still, Jed nodded his agreement. "If it comes to that," he promised. But it won't. A distant sound drew their attention, not the expected approach of riders, but something different. A rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the air itself. "What is that?" Abby asked, scanning the sky. Jed listened intently, recognition dawning. Horses, many of them moving fast. They tensed, preparing for an assault from multiple directions, but when the riders finally appeared around a bend in the canyon, they were not Patterson's men. A band of mounted Native Americans approached at speed, their faces painted for war rifles and bows at the ready. Jed and Abby exchanged glances of alarm, uncertain whether this new development represented salvation or a different kind of danger. As the riders drew closer, Jed raised his rifle, not aiming, but ready. The band halted a short distance away, and a single rider came forward, a man whose bearing marked him as a leader. To Jed and Abby's astonishment, he called out in perfect English, "Jedediah Calloway, Abigail Hayes Thomas Brown sent us to find you." Relief flooded through them both so intense it was almost painful. The Ute allies Thomas had mentioned had found them before Patterson's men could close the trap. The leader introduced himself as Swift Hawk, explaining that Thomas had reached their camp shortly after separating from Jed and Abby. Hearing of their situation, the Ute band had immediately mounted a rescue mission, intercepting Patterson's men and driving them back from the canyon entrance before coming to find the fugitives. "Thomas rides for my father's trading post," Swift Hawk informed them. "He will meet us there with fresh horses for your journey to Denver." As they prepared to depart with their unexpected rescuers, Jed found himself overwhelmed by a sense of providence that amid all the danger and seemingly insurmountable obstacles, allies had appeared at the moment of greatest need. Abby seemed to read his thoughts. "My father would call this God's hand at work," she said softly, as they mounted horses provided by their rescuers. "I'm beginning to think he might be right." Jed, never a religious man, despite his upbringing, found it difficult to argue with the sentiment. Whatever force had brought them safely through thus far, divine intervention or simple human determination, he was grateful for it. As they rode out of the canyon surrounded by their Ute protectors, the path to Denver and justice finally seemed clear. Patterson's reach, though extensive, had its limits. Beyond those limits lay hope, not just for retribution, but for the healing that might follow. Jed glanced at Abby, riding beside him, with her head held high despite the exhaustion etched in every line of her body. In her strength, her courage, her unwavering commitment to what was right, he had found something he had believed lost forever: faith. Not just in justice or in providence, but in the possibility of a future worth building, a life beyond vengeance and grief. Whatever awaited them in Denver, whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. And in that knowledge was a peace Jed had not known since he had returned to find his home in ashes and his family gone. The sun shone bright overhead, illuminating the path before them as they rode toward whatever destiny awaited no longer fugitives, but pilgrims on a journey toward justice and perhaps redemption.